This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on March 3rd, 2006. The Getting of Wisdom by Henry Handel Richardson. Dedication to my unnamed little collaborator. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting get understanding. Proverbs 4, verse 7. Chapter 1. The 4 children were lying on the grass. "And the prince went further and further into the forest," said the elder girl, "till he came to a beautiful glade. A glade, you know, is a place in the forest that is open and green and lovely, and there he saw a beautiful lady with a long white dress that hung down to her ankles, with a golden belt and a golden crown. She was lying on the sward. Sward, you know, is grass as smooth as velvet, just like green velvet, and the prince saw the marks of travel on her garments. The bottom of the lovely silk dress was all dirty. 'Wondrous fair, if you don't mind, you'll make that sheet dirty too,' said Pin. 'Shut up, will you?' answered her sister, who, carried away by her narrative, had approached her boots to some linen that was bleaching. 'Yes, but Sarah'll be awfully cross if she has to wash it again,' said Pin, who was practical. 'You'll put me out altogether,' cried Laura angrily. 'Well, as I said, the edge of her robe was all muddy. No, I don't think I will say that. It sounds far prettier if it's clean. So it hung in long, straight, beautiful folds to her ankles, and the prince saw 2 little feet in golden sandals peeping out from under the hem of the silken gown, and—' 'But what about the marks of travel?' asked Leppie. 'Donkey! Haven't I said they weren't there? If I say they weren't, then they weren't. She hadn't travelled at all.' 'Oh, parakeets!' cried little Frank. 4 pairs of eyes went up to the bright green flock that was passing over the garden. 'Now you've all interrupted, and I shan't tell any more,' said Laura in a proud voice. 'Oh, yes, please do, Wondrous Fair. Tell what happened next,' begged Pin and Leppie. 'No, not another word. You can only think of sheets and parakeets.' 'Please, Wondrous Fair,' begged little Frank. 'No, I can't now. Another thing, I don't mind if you call me Laura today, as it is the last day.' She lay back on the grass, her hands clasped under her head. A voice was heard, loud, imperative. 'Laura, I want you. Come here.' 'That's Mother calling,' said Pin. Laura kicked her heels. The 2 little boys laughed approval. 'Go on, Laura,' coaxed Pin. 'Mother'll be angry. I'll come too.' Laura raised herself with a grumble. 'It's to try on that horrid dress.' In very fact, Mother was standing, already somewhat impatient with the dress in her hand. Laura wriggled out of the one she had on, and stood stiffly and ungraciously, with her arms held like pokers from her sides, while Mother, on her knees, arranged the length. 'Don't put on a face like that, miss,' she said sharply, on seeing Laura's air. 'Do you think I'm making it for my own pleasure?' She had sewn at it all day, and was hot and tired. 'It's too short,' said Laura, looking down. 'It's nothing of the kind,' said Mother, whose mouth was full of pins. 'It is. It's much too short.' Mother gave her head a slight shake. 'Don't you contradict me. Do you want to tell me I don't know what a length you're to wear in your dresses?' 'I won't wear it at all if you don't make it longer,' said Laura defiantly. Pin's chubby, featureless little face lengthened with apprehension. 'Do let her have it just a teeny bit longer, Mother dear,' she pleaded. 'Now, Pin, what have you got to do with it, I'd like to know?' said Mother, on the verge of losing her temper over the back folds, which would not hang. 'I'm going to school tomorrow, and it's a shame,' said Laura, in the low, passionate voice that never failed to exasperate Mother, so different was it from her own hearty fashion of venting displeasure. Pin began to sniff in sheer nervous anxiety. 'Very well, then, I won't do another stitch to it,' said Mother, now angry in earnest, and got up and bounced out of the room. 'Laura, how can you?' said Pin, dissolving. 'It was only you who make her so cross.' 'I don't care,' said Laura rebelliously. though she was not far off tears herself. "It is a shame. All the other girls will have dresses down to the tops of their boots, and they'll laugh at me, and call me a baby." And touched by the thought of what lay before her, she too began to sniffle. She did not fail, however, to roll the dress up and to throw it into a corner of the room. She also kicked the ewer, which fell over and flooded the floor. Pin cried more loudly, and ran to fetch Sarah. Laura returned to the garden. The two little boys came up to her, but she waved them back. "Leave me alone, children. I want to think." She stood in a becoming attitude by the garden gate, her brothers hovering in the background. Then Mother called once more. "Laura, where are you?" "Here, Mother. What is it?" "Did you knock this jug over, or did Pin?" "I did it, Mother." "Did you do it on purpose?" "Yes." "Come here to me." She went with lagging steps, but Mother's anger had passed. She was at work on the dress again, and by squinting her eyes Laura could see that a piece was being added to the skirt. She was penitent at once, and when Mother in a sorry voice said, "I'm ashamed of you, Laura, and on your last day, too," her throat grew narrow. "I didn't mean it, Mother." "If only you would ask properly for things, you would get them." Laura knew this, knew indeed that did she coax, Mother would refuse her nothing. But coaxing came hard to her. Something within her forbade it. Sarah called her high-stomached, to the delight of the other children and her own indignation. She had explained to them again and again what Sarah really meant. On leaving the house, she went straight to the flower-beds. She would give Mother, who liked flowers very well but had no time to gather them, a bouquet quite the size of a cabbage. Pin and the boys were summoned to help her, and when their hands were full, Laura led the way to a secluded part of the garden on the farther side of the detached brick kitchen. In this strip, which was filled with greenery, little sun fell. 2 thick fir trees and a monstrous blue gum stood there. High bushes screened the fence. Jessamine climbed the wall of the house and encircled the bedroom windows, and on the damp and shady ground only violets grew. Yet with the love children bear to the limited and compact, the four had chosen their own little plots here, rather than in the big garden at the back of the house, and many were the times they had all begun anew to dig and to rake. But if Laura's energy did not fizzle out as quickly as usual, she was the model for the rest. Mother was sure to discover that it was too cramped and dark for them in there, and send Sarah to drive them off. Here, safely screened from sight, Laura sat on a bench and made up her bouquet. When it was finished, red and white in the centre with a darker border, the whole surrounded by a ring of violet leaves, she looked about for something to tie it up with. Sarah, applied to, was busy ironing, and had no string in the kitchen, so Pin ran to get a reel of cotton. But while she was away, Laura had an idea. Bidding Leppy hold the flowers tight in both his sticky little hands, she climbed in at her bedroom window, or rather, by lying on the sill with her legs waving in the air, she managed to grab, without losing her balance, a pair of scissors from the chest of drawers. With these between her teeth, she emerged, to the excited interest of the boys, who watched her open-mouthed. Laura had dark curls, Pin fair, and both of them wore them flopping at their backs, the only difference being that Laura, who was now 12 years old, had for the past year been allowed to bind hers together with a ribbon, while Pin's bobbed as they chose. Every morning, early, Mother brushed and twisted with a kind of grim pride these silky ringlets round her finger. Although the 5 odd minutes of the curling occupied were durance vile to Laura, the child was proud of her hair in her own way, and when in the street she heard someone say, "Look, what pretty curls," she would give her head a toss and send them all a-rippling. In addition to this, there was a crowning glory connected to them. One hot December morning, when they had been tangled and Mother had kept her standing too long, she had fainted, pulling the whole dressing-table down about her ears, and ever since She had been marked off in some mysterious fashion from the other children. Mother would not let her go out at midday in summer. Sarah would say, "Let that be, can't you?" did she try to lift something that was too heavy for her, and the younger children were to be quelled by a threat to faint on the spot if they did not do as she wished. Laura's faint had become a byword in the family, and Laura herself held it for so important a fact in her life that she had more than once begun a friendship with the words, "Have you ever fainted? I have." From among these long glossy curls she now cut one of the longest and most spiral, cut it off close to the root, and with it bound the flowers together. Mother should see that she did know how to give up something she cared for, and was not as selfish as she was usually supposed to be. "Oh," said both little boys in a breath, then doubled up in noisy mirth. Laura was constantly doing something to set their young blood in amazement. They looked upon her as the personification of all that was startling and unexpected. But Pin, returning with a reel of thread, opened her eyes in a different way. "Oh, Laura," she began, tearful at once. "Now, Resvor," retorted Laura scornfully. Resvor was Sarah's name for Pin, on account of her perpetual wateriness. "Be a cry-baby, do." But she was not dampened. She was lost in the pleasure of self-sacrifice. Pin looked after her as she danced off, then moved submissively in her wake to be near at hand should intercession be needed. Laura was so unsuspecting, and Mother would be so cross. In her dim, childish way, Pin longed to see these, her two nearest, at peace. She understood them both so well, and they had little or no understanding for each other, so she crept to the house at her sister's heels. Laura did not go indoors. Hiding against the wall of the flagged veranda, she threw her bouquet in at the window, meaning it to fall on Mother's lap. But Mother had dropped her needle, and was just lifting her face, flushed with stooping, when the flowers hit her thwack on the head. She groped again, impatiently to find out what had struck her, recognized the peace offering, and thought of the surprise cake that was going into Laura's box on the morrow. Then she saw the curl, and her face darkened. Was there ever such a tiresome child? What in the world would she do next? "Laura, come here directly." Laura had moved away. She was not expecting recognition. If Mother were pleased, she would call Pin to put the flowers in water for her, and that would be the end of it. The idea of a word of thanks would have made Laura feel uncomfortable. Now, however, at the tone of Mother's voice, her mouth set stubbornly. She went indoors as bidden, but was already up in arms again. "You're a very naughty girl indeed," began Mother, as soon as she appeared. "How dare you cut off your hair? Upon my word, if it weren't your last night, I'd send you to bed without any supper." An unheard-of threat on the part of Mother, who punished her children in any way but that of denying them their food. "It's a very good thing you're leaving home tomorrow, for you'd soon be setting the others at defiance too, and I should have 4 naughty children on my hands instead of 1. But I'd be ashamed to go to school such a fright if I were you. Turn round at once and let me see you." Laura turned with a sinking heart. Pin cried softly in a corner. "She thought it would please you, Mother," she sobbed. "I will not have you interfering, Pin, when I'm speaking to Laura. She's old enough by now to know what I like and what I don't," said Mother, who was vexed at the thought of the child going among strangers thus disfigured. "And now get away, and don't let me see you again. You're a perfect sight." "Oh, Laura, you do look funny," said Leppie and Frank in a weak chorus as she passed them in the passage. "Well, you have made a guy of yourself this time, Miss Laura, and no mistake," said Sarah, who had heard the above. Laura went into her own room and locked the door, a thing Mother did not allow. She then threw herself on the bed and cried. Mother had not understood in the least, and she had made herself a sight into the bargain. She refused to open the door, though one after another rattled the handle, and Sarah threatened to turn on the hose at the window. So they left her alone, and she spent the evening in watery dudgeon on her pillow. But before she undressed for the night, she stealthily made a chink and took in a slice of the cake Pin had left at the doormat. Her natural buoyancy of spirit was beginning to reassert itself. By brushing her hair well to one side she could cover up the gap, she found, and after all there was something rather pleasant in knowing you were misunderstood. It made you feel different from everyone else. Mother, sewing hard even after the busy Sarah had retired, Mother smiled a stern little smile of amusement to herself, and before locking up for the night, put the dark curl safely away. So ends Chapter 1.
This reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. Chapter 2. Laura, sleeping flat on her stomach, was roused next morning by Pin, who said, "Wake up, Wondrous Fair, Mother wants to speak to you. She says you can get into bed in my place before you dress." Pin slept warm and cozy at Mother's side. Laura rose on her elbow and looked at her sister. Pin was standing in the doorway holding her nightgown to her, in such a way as to expose all of her thin little legs. "Come on," urged Pin. "Sarah's going to give me my bath while you're with Mother." "Go away, Pin," said Laura snappily. "I told you yesterday you could say Laura, and you're more like a spider than ever." Spider was another nickname for Pin, owing to her rotund little body and mere sticks of legs. She was all belly, as Sarah put it, and the mere mention of it made Pin fly, for she was very touchy about her legs. As soon as the door closed behind her, Laura sprang out of bed, and, waiting neither to wash herself nor to say her prayers, began to pull on her clothes, confusing strings and buttons in her haste, and quite forgetting that on this eventful morning she had meant to dress herself with more than ordinary care. She was just lacing her shoes when Sarah looked in. "Why, Miss Laura, don't you know your ma wants you?" "It's too late. I'm dressed now," said Laura darkly. Sarah shook her head. "Missis'll be fine and angry, and you needn't have had a row on your last day." Laura stole out of the door and ran down the garden to the summer-house. This, the size of a goodly room, was formed of a single dense, hairy-leafed tree, round the trunk of which a seat was built. Here she cowered, her elbows on her knees, her chin in her hands. Her face wore the stiff expression that went by the name of Laura's sulks, but her eyes were big and as watchful as those of a scared animal. If Sarah came to fetch her, she would hold on to the seat with both hands. But even if she had to yield to Sarah's greater strength, well, at least she was up and dressed. Not like the last time. About a week ago Mother had tried this kind of thing. Then she had been caught unawares. She had gone into Pin's warm place, curious and unsuspecting, and thereupon Mother had begun to talk seriously to her, and not with her usual directness. She had reminded Laura that she was growing up apace, and would soon be a woman, had told her that she must now begin to give up childish habits, and learn to behave in a modest and womanly way, all disagreeable, disturbing things, which Laura did not in the least want to hear. When it became clear to her what it was about, she had thrown back the bedclothes and escaped from the room, and since then she had been careful never to be long alone with Mother. But now half an hour went by, and no one came to fetch her. Her grim little face relaxed. She felt very hungry, too, and when at length she heard Pin calling, she jumped up and betrayed her hiding-place. "Laura! Laura, where are you? Mother says to come to breakfast, and not be silly. The coach'll be here in an hour." Taking hands, the sisters ran to the house. In the passage, Sarah was busy roping a battered tin box. With their own hands, the little boys had been allowed to paste on this a big sheet of note-paper, which bore, in Mother's writing, the words, "Miss Laura Tweedle Rambotham, the Ladies' College, Melbourne. Mother herself was standing at the breakfast table cutting sandwiches. "Come and eat your breakfast, child," was all she said at the moment. "The tea's quite cold." Laura sat down and fell to with appetite, but also with a side glance at the generous pile of bread and meat growing under Mother's hands. "I shall never eat all that," she said ungraciously. It galled her still to be considered a greedy child with an insatiable stomach. "I know better than you do what you'll eat," said Mother. "You'll be hungry enough by this evening, I can tell you, not getting any dinner." Pin's face fell at this prospect. "Oh, Mother, won't she really get any dinner?" she asked, and to her soft little heart going to school began to seem one of the blackest experiences life held. "Why, she'll be in the train, stupid, how can she?" said Sarah. "Do you think trains give you dinners?" "Oh, Mother, please cut ever such a lot," begged Pin, sniffing valiantly. Laura began to feel somewhat moved herself at this solicitude, and choked down a lump in her throat with a gulp of tea. But when Pin had gone with Sarah to pick some nectarines, Mother's face grew stern, and Laura's emotion passed. "I feel more troubled about you than I can say, Laura. I don't know how you'll ever get on in life. You're so disobedient and self-willed. It would serve you very well right, I'm sure, for not coming this morning, if I didn't give you a penny of pocket money to take to school." Laura had heard this threat before, and thought it wiser not to reply. Gobbling up the rest of her breakfast, she slipped away. With the other children at her heels, she made a round of the garden, bidding good-bye to things and places. There were the 2 summer houses, in which she had played house, in which she had cooked and eaten and slept. There was the tall fir tree with the rung-like branches, by which she had been accustomed to climb to the very tree-top. There was the wilderness of bamboo and cane where she had been Crusoe, the ancient, broad-leaved cactus on which she had scratched their names and drawn their portraits. Here, the high aloe that had such a mysterious charm for you, because you never knew when the 100 years might expire, and the aloe burst into flower. Here again was the old fig-tree, with the rounded polished boughs, from which, seated as in a cradle, she had played Juliet to Pin's Romeo, and vice versa, but oftenest Juliet, for though Laura greatly preferred to be the ardent lover at the foot, Pin was but a poor climber, and, as she clung trembling to her branch, needed so much prompting in her lines, even then to repeat them with such feeble emphasis, that Laura invariably lost patience with her, and the love scene ended in a squabble. Passing behind a wooden fence which was a tangle of passion-flower, she opened the door of the fowl-house, and out strutted the mother-hen, followed by her pretty brood. Laura had given each of the chicks a name, and she now took Napoleon and Garibaldi up in her hand, and laid her cheek against their downy breasts, the younger children following her movements in respectful silence. Between the bars of the rabbit hutch she thrust enough green stuff to last the 2 little occupants for days, and everywhere she went she was accompanied by a legless magpie, which, in spite of its infirmity, hopped cheerily and quickly on its stumps. Laura had rescued it and reared it. It followed her like a dog, and she was only less devoted to it than she had been to a native bear, which died under her hands. "Now listen, children," she said, as she rose from her knees before the hutch. "If you don't look well after Maggie and the bunnies, I don't know what I'll do. The chicks'll be all right. Sarah'll take care of them, 'cause of the eggs. But Maggie and the bunnies don't have eggs, and if they're not fed, or if Frank treads on Maggie again, then they'll die. Now, if you let them die, I don't know what I'll do to you. Yes, I do. I'll send the devil to you at night when the room's dark, before you go to sleep. So there." "How can you if you're not here?" asked Leppie. Pin, however, who believed in ghosts and apparitions with all her fearful little heart, promised tremulously never, never to forget. But Laura was not satisfied until each of them in turn had repeated, in a low voice, with the appropriate gestures, the sacred secret and forbidden formula. Is my finger wet? Is my finger dry? God'll strike me dead if I tell a lie. Then Sarah's voice was heard calling, and the boys went out into the road to wait for the coach. Laura's dressing proved a lengthy business, and was accomplished amid bustle and scolding, and little peacemaking words from Pin, for in her hurry that morning Laura had forgotten to put on the clean linen Mother had laid beside the bed, and consequently had now to strip to the skin. The boys announced the coming of the coach with shrill cries, and simultaneously the rumble of wheels was heard. Sarah came from the kitchen drying her hands, and Pin began to cry. "Now shut up, Resver," said Sarah roughly. Her own eyes were moist. "You don't see Miss Laura be such a silly Billy. Anyone'd think you was goin', not her." The ramshackle old vehicle, one of Cobb's Royal Mail coaches, big-bodied, lumbering, scarlet, pulled by 2 stout horses, drew up before the door, and the driver climbed down from his seat. "Now, good day to you, ma'am. Good day, miss." This to Sarah, who, picking up the box, handed it to him to be strapped on under the apron. "Well, well, and so the little girl's going to school, is she? My, but time flies. Well do I remember the day, ma'am, when I drove you all across for the first time. These children wasn't big enough then to get up and down by themselves. Now I warrant you they can. Just look at 'em, will you? But my, ain't you ashamed of yourself?" He spoke to Pin. "Pipe in your eye like that? Why, you'll flood the road if you don't hold on. Yes, yes, ma'am, bless you. I'll look after her, and put her into the train wid me own hands. Don't you be uneasy. The Lord he cares for the widder and the orphan, and if he don't, why, Patrick O'Donnell does." This was O'Donnell's standing joke. He uttered it with a loud chuckle. While speaking, he had let down the steps and helped the 3 children up. They were to ride with Laura to the outskirts of the township. The little boys giggled excitedly at his assertion that the horses would not be equal to the weight. Only Pin wept on, in undiminished grief. "Now, Miss Laura." "Now, Laura, good-bye, darling, and do try and be good. And be sure you write once a week, and tell me everything, whether you are happy, and if you get enough to eat, and if you have enough blankets on your bed. And remember always to change your boots if you get your feet wet. And don't lean out the window in the train." For some time past Laura had had need of all her self-control, not to cry before the children. As the hour drew near, it had grown harder and harder. While dressing, she had resorted to counting the number of times the profile of a Roman emperor appeared in the flowers on the wallpaper. Now the worst moment of all was come, the moment of good-bye. She did not look at Pin, but she heard her tireless, snuffly weeping, and set her own lips tight. "Yes, mother. No, mother," she answered shortly. "I'll be all right. Good-bye." She could not, however, restrain a kind of dry sob, which jumped up her throat. When she was in the coach, Sarah, whom she had forgotten, climbed up to kiss her, and there was some joking between O'Donnell and the servant while the steps were being folded and put away. Laura did not smile. Her thin little face was very pale. Mother's heart went out to her in a pity which she did not know how to express. "Don't forget your sandwiches, and when you're alone, feel in the pocket of your ulster, and you'll find something nice. Good-bye, darling." "Good-bye. Good-bye." The driver had mounted to his seat. He unwound the reins, cried, "Get up!" to the 2 burly horses. The vehicle was set in motion and trundled down the main street. Until it turned the corner by the Shire Gardens, Laura let her handkerchief fly from the window. Sarah waved hers, then wiped her eyes and lustily blew her nose. Mother only sighed. It was all she could do to keep up, she said, as much to herself as to Sarah. I do hope she'll be all right. She seems such a child to be sending off like this. Yet what else could I do? To a state school, I've always said it, my children shall never go. Not if I have to beg the money to send them elsewhere. But she sighed again, in spite of the energy of her words, and stood gazing at the place where the coach had disappeared. She was still a comparatively young woman, and straight of body, but trouble, poverty, and night watches had scored many lines on her forehead. "Don't you worry," said Sarah. "Miss Laura'll be all right. She's just a bit too clever. Brains for two, that's what it is. And children will grow up and get big, and change their feathers." She spoke absently, drawing her metaphor from a brood of chickens which had strayed across the road, and was now trying to mount the wooden veranda. "Shoo! Get away with you!" "I know that, but Laura... The other children have never given me a moment's worry, but Laura's different. I seem to get less and less able to manage her. If only her father had been alive to help." "I'm sure no father livin' could do more than you for those blessed children," said Sarah with impatience. "You think of nothing else. It'd be a great deal better if you took more care of yourself. You sit up nights and don't get no proper sleep slavin' away at that blessed embroidery and stuff, so as Miss Laura can get off to school and to her books. And then you want to worry over her as well. She'll be all right. Miss Laura's like peas. You've got to get 'em out of the pod. They're in there, sure enough. And besides, I guess school'll knock all the nonsense out of her." "Oh, I hope they won't be too hard on her," said Mother in quick alarm. "Shut the side gate, will you? Those children have left it open again. And, Sarah, I think we'll turn out the drawing-room." Sarah grunted to herself as she went to close the gate. This had not entered into her scheme of work for the day, and her cooking was still undone. But she did not gainsay her mistress, as she otherwise would have made no scruple of doing, for she knew that nothing was more helpful to the latter in a crisis than hard manual work. Besides, Sarah herself had a sneaking weakness for what she called drawing-room days. For the drawing-room was the storehouse of what treasures had remained over from a past prosperity. It was crowded with bric-a-brac and ornament, and as her mistress took these objects up one by one to dust and polish them, she would, if she were in a good humour, tell Sarah where and how they had been bought, or describe the places they had originally come from, so that Sarah, pausing, broom in hand, to listen, had with time gathered some vague ideas of a country like India, for example, whence came the little silver pagodi, and the expressionless brass god, who squatted vacantly and at ease. End of Chapter 2. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 4th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Read and recorded by Betsy Bush. Marquette, Michigan, March 2006. Chapter 3. As long as the coach rolled down the main street, Laura sat bolt upright at the window. In fancy she heard people telling one another that this was little Miss Rambotham going to school. She was particularly glad that just as they went past the Commercial Hotel, Miss Parotet, the landlord's red-haired daughter, should put her fuzzy head out of the window, for Miss Parotet had also been to boarding school, and thought very highly of herself in consequence, though it had only been for a year to finish. At the National Bank the manager's wife waved a friendly hand to the children, and at the Royal Mail Hotel, where they drew up for passengers or commissions, Mrs. Paget, the stout landlady, came out, smoothing down her black satin apron. "Well, I'm sure I wonder your ma likes sending you off so alone." The ride had comforted Pin a little, but when they had passed the chief stores and the flour mill, and were come to a part of the road where the houses were fewer, her tears broke out afresh. The very last house was left behind. The high machinery of the claims came into view, the watery flats where Chinamen were forever rocking wash-dirt in cradles, and O'Donnell dismounted and opened the door. He lifted the three out one by one, shaking his head in humorous dismay at Pin, and as little Frank showed signs of beginning too by puckering up his face and doubling up his body, the kindly man tried to make him laugh by asking if he had the stomach-ache. Laura had one more glimpse of the children standing hand in hand. Even in her trouble Pin did not forget her charges. Then a sharp bend in the road hid them from her sight. She was alone in the capacious body of the coach, alone, and the proud excitement of parting was over. The staunchly repressed tears welled up with a gush, and flinging herself down across the seat she cried bitterly. It was not a childishly irresponsible grief like Pin's. It was more passionate and went deeper, and her overloaded feelings were soon relieved. But as she was not used to crying, she missed the moment at which she might have checked herself, and went on shedding tears after they had become a luxury. "Why, goodness gracious, what's this?" cried a loud, cheerful, and astonished voice, and a fat, rosy face beamed in on Laura. "Why, here's a little girl in here, crying fit to break her heart. Come, come, my dear, what's the matter? Don't cry like that, now, don't." The coach had stopped, the door opened, and a stout woman climbed in, bearing a big basket, and followed by a young man with straw-colored whiskers. Laura sat up like a dart and pulled her hat straight, crimson with mortification at being discovered in such a plight. She had instantly curbed her tears, but she could not disguise the fact that she had red eyes and a swollen nose, that she was in short what Sarah called all bunged up. She made no reply to the newcomer's exclamations, but sat clutching her handkerchief and staring out of the window. The woman's good-natured curiosity, however, was not to be done. "You poor little thing," she persisted. "Wherever are you going, my dear, so alone?" "I'm going to boarding school," said Laura, and shot a glance at the couple opposite. "To boarding school? Peter, do you hear? Why, whatever's your ma thinking of to send such a little chick as you to boarding school, and so alone, too?" Laura's face took on a curious air of dignity. "I'm not so very little," she answered, and went on to explain in phrases which she had heard so often that she knew them by heart. "Only small for my age. I was 12 in spring, and I have to go to school because I've learnt all I can at home." This failed to impress the woman. "Snakes alive! That's young enough in all conscience. And such a delicate little creature, too, just like that one o' Sam MacFarlane's that popped off last Christmas, isn't she, Peter?" Peter, who avoided looking at Laura, sheepishly mumbled something about like enough she was. "And who is your ma, my dear? What's your name?" continued her interrogator. Laura replied politely, but there was a reserve in her manner which, together with the name she gave, told enough. The widow, Laura's mother, had the reputation of being stuck up, and of bringing up her children in the same way. The woman did not press Laura further. She whispered something behind her hand to Peter, then searching in her basket found a large red apple, which she held out with an encouraging nod and smile. "Here, my dear, here's something for you. Don't cry any more, don't now. It'll be all right." Laura, who was well aware that she had not shed a tear since the couple entered the coach, coloured deeply, and made a movement, half shy, half unwilling, to put her hands behind her. "Oh, no, thank you," she said in extreme embarrassment, not wishing to hurt the giver's feelings. "Mother doesn't care for us to take things from strangers." "Bless her soul!" cried the stout woman in amaze. "It's only an apple. Now, my dear, just you take it, and make your mind easy. Your ma wouldn't have nothing against it today, I'm sure of that, going away so far and all so alone like this. It's sweet and juicy." "It's Melbourne you'll be bound for, I dessay," said the yellow-haired Peter so suddenly that Laura started. She confirmed this, and let her solemn eyes rest on him, wondering why he was so red and fidgety and uncomfortable. The woman said at the length of the journey Laura was undertaking, and Peter, growing still redder, volunteered another remark. I was nigh to bein' in Melbourne once myself," he said. "Aye, and you can't never forget it, the silly loon," threw in the woman, but so good-naturedly that it was impossible, Laura felt, for Peter to take offence. She gazed at the pair, speculating upon the relation they stood in to each other. She had obediently put out her hand for the apple, and now sat holding it, without attempting to eat it. It had not been Mother's precepts alone that had weighed with her in declining it. She was mortified at the idea of being bribed, as it were, to be good, just as though she were Pin or one of the little boys. It was a punishment on her for having been so babyish as to cry. Had she not been caught in the act, the woman would never have ventured to be so familiar. The very largeness and rosiness of the fruit made it hateful to her, and she turned over in her mind how she would get rid of it. As the coach bumped along, her fellow passengers sat back and shut their eyes. The road was shadeless. Beneath the horses' feet a thick red dust rose like smoke. The grass by the wayside under the scattered gum trees or round the big black boulders that dotted the hillocks was burnt to straw. In time, Laura also grew drowsy, and she was just falling into a doze when, with a jerk, the coach pulled up at the halfway house. Here her companions alighted, and there were more nods and smiles from the woman. "You eat it, my dear. I'm sure your ma won't say nothin'," was her last remark, as she pushed the swing door and vanished into the house, followed by Peter. Then the driver's pleasant face appeared at the window of the coach. In one hand he held a glass, in the other a bottle of lemonade. "Here, little woman, have a drink. It's warm work ridin'." Now this was quite different from the matter of the apple. Laura's throat was parched with dust and tears. She accepted the offer gratefully, thinking as she drank how envious Pin would be, could she see her drinking bottled lemonade. Then the jolting and rumbling began anew. No one else got in, and when they had passed the only two landmarks she knew, the leprous Chinaman's hut and the market garden of Ah Chow, who twice a week jaunted at a half-trot to the township, with his hanging baskets, to supply people with vegetables. When they had passed these, Laura fell asleep. She wakened with a start to find that the coach had halted to apply the brakes, at the top of the precipitous hill that led down to the railway township. In a two-wheeled buggy this was an exciting descent, but the coach jammed on both its brakes, moved like a snail, and seemed hardly able to crawl. At the foot of the hill the little town lay sluggish in the sun. Although it was close to midday, but few people were astir in the streets, for the place had long since ceased to be an important mining centre. The chief claims were worked out, and the coming of the railway had been powerless to give it impetus to a new life. It was always like this in these streets of low, verandaed, red brick houses, always dull and sleepy, and such animation as there was invariably to be found before the doors of the many public-houses. At one of these the coach stopped and unloaded its goods for an interminable time. People came and looked in at the window at Laura, and she was beginning to feel alarmed lest O'Donnell, who had gone inside, had forgotten all about her having to catch the train, when out he came, wiping his lips. "Now for the living luggage," he said with a wink, and Laura drew back in confusion from the laughter of a group of larrikins round the door. It was indeed high time at the station. No sooner was her box dislodged and her ticket taken than the train steamed in. O'Donnell recommended her to the guard's care. She shook hands with him and thanked him, and had just been locked into a carriage by herself when he came running down the platform again, holding in his hand for everyone to see the apple, which Laura believed she had safely hidden under the cushions of the coach. Red to the roots of her hair, she had to receive it before a number of heads put out to see what the matter was, and she was even forced to thank O'Donnell into the bargain. Then the guard came along once more and told her he would let no one get in beside her. She need not be afraid. "Yes, and will you please tell me when we come to Melbourne?" Directly the train was clear of the station, she lowered a window, and taking aim at a telegraph post, threw the apple from her with all her might. Then she hung out of the window as far as she could, till her hat was nearly carried off. This was the first railway journey she had made by herself, and there was an intoxicating sense of freedom in being locked in, alone, within the narrow compass of the compartment. She was at liberty to do everything that had previously been forbidden her. She walked up and down the carriage, jumped from one seat to another, then lay flat on her back, singing to herself, and watched the telegraph poles fly past the windows, and the wires mount and descend. But now came a station, and, though the train did not stop, she sat up, in order that people might see she was travelling alone. She grew hungry and attacked her lunch, and it turned out that Mother had not provided too much after all. When she had finished, had brushed herself clean of crumbs, and handled, till her finger-tips were sore, the pompous half-crown she had found in her pocket, she fell to thinking of them at home, and of what they would now be doing. It was between 2 and 3 o'clock. The sun would be full on the flagstones of the back veranda. Inch by inch, Pin and Leppie would be driven away to find a cooler spot for their afternoon game, while little Frank slept, and Sarah splashed the dinner dishes in the brick-floored kitchen. Mother sat sewing, and she would still be sitting there, still sewing, when the shadow of the fir tree, which at noon had shrunken like a dwarf, had stretched to giant size, and the children had opened the front gate to play in the shade of the public footpath. At the thought of these shadows, of all the familiar things she could not see again for months to come, Laura's eyelids began to smart. They had flashed through several stations. Now they stopped, and her mind was diverted by the noise and bustle. As the train swung into motion again, she fell into a pleasanter line of thought. She painted to herself, for the 100th time, the new life towards which she was journeying, and as always in the brightest colours. She had arrived at school, and in a spacious apartment which was a kind of glorified mother's drawing-room, was being introduced to a bevy of girls. They clustered round, urgent to make the acquaintance of the newcomer, who gave her hand to each with an easy grace and an appropriate word. They were too well bred to cast a glance at her clothes, which, however she might embellish them in fancy, Laura knew were not what they ought to be. Her ulster was some years old, and so short that it did not cover the flounce of her dress, and this dress, and her hat with it, were Mother's taste, and consequently Laura felt sure nobody else's. But her new companions saw that she wore these clothes with an elegance that made up for their shortcomings, and she heard them whisper, "Isn't she pretty? What black eyes! What lovely curls!" But she was not proud, and by her ladylike manners soon made them feel at home with her, even though they stood agape at her cleverness. None of them could claim to have absorbed the knowledge of a whole house. With one of her admirers she had soon formed a friendship that was the wonder of all who saw it. In deep respect the others drew back, forming a kind of alley, down which, with linked arms, the two friends sauntered, blind to everything but themselves, and having embarked upon her sea of dreams, Laura set sail and was speedily borne away. "Next station you'll be there, little girl." She sprang up and looked about her with vacant eyes. This had been the last stoppage, and the train was passing through the flats. In less than 2 minutes she had collected her belongings, tidied her hair, and put on her gloves. Some time afterwards they steamed in alongside a gravelled platform, among the stones of which a few grass blades grew. This was Melbourne. At the nearer end of the platform stood 2 ladies, one stout and elderly in bonnet and mantle, with glasses mounted on a black stick, and short-sighted peering eyes. The other stout and comely too, but young, with a fat, laughing face and rosy cheeks. Laura descried them a long way off, and as the carriage swept past them, they also saw her, eager and prominent at her window. Both stared at her, and the younger lady said something and laughed. Laura instantly connected the remark and the amusement it caused the speaker with the showy red lining of her hat, at which she believed their eyes had been directed. She also realized that it was too late, that her greeting had been childish, unnecessarily effusive, for the ladies had responded only by nods. Here were 2 thrusts to parry at once, and Laura's cheeks tingled, but she did not cease to smile, and she was still wearing this weak little smile, which did its best to seem easy and unconcerned, when she alighted from the train. End of Chapter 3. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush. Marquette, Michigan, March 2006. Chapter 4. The elderly lady was Laura's godmother. She lived at Prahran, and it was at her house that Laura would sometimes spend a monthly holiday. Godmother was good to them all in a brusque, sharp-tongued fashion, but Pin was her especial favourite, and she made no secret of it. Her companion on the platform was a cousin of Laura's, of at least twice Laura's age, who invariably struck awe into the children by her loud and ironic manner of speech. She was an independent, manly person, in spite of her plump roundness. She lived by herself in lodgings, and earned her own living as a clerk in an office. The first greetings over, Godmother's attention was entirely taken up by Laura's box. After this had been picked out from among the other luggage, grave doubts were expressed whether it could be got on to the back seat of the pony carriage, to which it was conveyed by a porter and the boy. Laura stood shyly by and waited, while Cousin Grace kept up the conversation by putting abrupt and embarrassing questions. "How's your ma?" she demanded rather than asked, in the slangy and jocular tone she employed. "I guess she'll be thanking her stars she's got rid of you." At which Laura smiled uncertainly, not being sure whether Cousin Grace spoke in jest or earnest. "I suppose you think no end of yourself going to boarding school," continued the latter. "Oh, no, not at all," protested Laura with due modesty, and as both at question and answer, Cousin Grace laughed boisterously. Laura was glad to hear Godmother calling, "Come, jump in, the ponies won't stand." Godmother was driving herself, a low basket carriage harnessed to two buff-colored ponies. Laura sat with her back to them. Godmother flapped the reins and said, "Get up!" But she was still fretted about the box, which was being held on behind by the boy. An inch larger, she asserted, and it would have had to be left behind. Laura eyed its battered sides uneasily. Godmother might remember, she thought, that it contained her whole wardrobe, and she wondered how many of Godmother's own ample gowns could be compressed into so small a space. "All my clothes are inside," she explained, "that I shall need for months." "Ah, I expect your poor mother has sat up sewing herself to death, that you may be as well dressed as the rest of them," said Godmother, and heaved a doleful sigh. But Cousin Grace laughed the wide laugh that displayed a mouthful of great, healthy teeth. "What? All your clothes in there?" she cried. "I say, you couldn't be a queen if you hadn't more togs than that." "Oh, I know," Laura hastened to reply, and grew very red. "Queens need a lot more than I've got." "Tut, tut," said Godmother, who did not understand the allusion, which referred to a former ambition of Laura's. "Don't talk such nonsense to the child." She drove very badly, and they went by quiet by-streets to escape the main traffic. The pony chaise wobbled at random from one side of the road to the other, obstacles looming up only just in time for Godmother to see them. The ponies shook and tossed their heads at the constant sawing of the bits, and Laura had to be continually ducking to keep out of the way of the reins. She let the unfamiliar streets go past her in a kind of dream, and there was silence for a time, broken only by Godmother's expostulations with the ponies, till Cousin Grace, growing tired of playing her bright eyes first on this, then on that, brought them back to Laura and studied her up and down. "I say, who on earth trimmed your hat?" she asked almost at once. "Mother," answered Laura bravely, while the colour mounted to her cheeks again. "Well, I guess she made up her mind you shouldn't get lost as long as you wore it," went on her cousin with disconcerting candour. "It makes you look just like a great big red double dahlia." "Let the child be. She looks well enough," threw in Godmother in her snappish way. But Laura was sure that she too disapproved, and felt more than she heard the muttered remark about Jane always having a taste for something gay. "Oh, I like the colour very much. I chose it myself," said Laura, and looked straight at the two faces before her, but her lips twitched. She would have liked to snatch the hat from her head, to throw it in front of the ponies, and hear them trample it under their hoofs. She had never wanted the scarlet lining of the big, upturned brim. In a dislike to being conspicuous which was incomprehensible to Mother, she had implored the latter to leave it plain. But Mother had said, "Nonsense, and hold your tongue, and I know better," with this result. Oh, yes, she saw well enough how Godmother signed with her eyes to Cousin Grace to say no more. But she pretended not to notice, and for the remainder of the drive nobody spoke. They went past long lines of grey houses, joined one to another and built exactly alike, past large fenced-in public parks, where all kinds of odd, unfamiliar trees grew, with branches that ran right down their trunks, and bushy leaves. The broad streets were hilly. The wind, coming in puffs, met them with clouds of gritty white dust. They had just, with bent heads, their hands at their hats, passed through one of these miniature whirlwinds, when turning a corner they suddenly drew up, and the boys sprang to the ponies' heads. Laura, who had not been expecting the end so soon, saw only a tall wooden fence, but Cousin Grace looked higher, gave a stagey shudder, and cried, "Oh, my eye, Betty Martin! Aren't I glad it isn't me that's going to school! It looks just like a prison!" It certainly was an imposing building viewed from within, when the paling gates had closed behind them. To Laura, who came from a township of one-storied brick or weatherboard houses, it seemed vast in its breadth and height, appalling in its sombre grayness. Between Godmother and Cousin Grace she walked up an asphalted path, and mounted the steps that led to a massive stone portico. The bell Godmother rang made no answering sound, but after a very few seconds the door swung back, and a slender maidservant in cap and apron stood before them. She smiled at them pleasantly as, in Chinaman fashion, they crossed the threshold. Then, inclining her head at a murmured word from Godmother, she vanished as lightly as she had come, and they sat and looked about them. They were in a plainly furnished but long, lofty waiting room. There were 2 large windows, the Venetian blinds had not been lowered, and the afternoon sun, beating in, displayed a shabby patch on the carpet. It showed up, too, a coating of dust that had gathered on the desk-like central table. There was the faint, distinctive smell of strange furniture, but what impressed Laura most was the stillness. No street noises pierced the massy walls, but neither did the faintest echo of all that might be taking place in the great building itself reach their ears. They sat aloof, shut off, as it were, from the living world, and this feeling soon grew downright oppressive. It must be like this to be dead, thought Laura to herself, and inconsequently remembered a quarter of an hour she had once spent in a dentist's anteroom. There, as here, the same soundless vacancy, the same anguished expectancy. Now, as then, her heart began to thump so furiously that she was afraid the others would hear it, but they, too, were subdued. Though Cousin Grace tittered continually, she heard only a gentle wheezing, and even Godmother expressed the hope that they would not be kept waiting long, under her breath. But minute after minute went by. There they sat, and nothing happened. It began to seem as if they might sit on forever. All of a sudden, from out the spacious halls of which they had caught a glimpse on arriving, brisk steps began to come towards them over the oilcloth. At first as a mere tapping in the distance, then rapidly gaining in weight and decision. Laura's palpitations reached their extreme limit. Another second, and they might have burst her chest. Cousin Grace ceased to giggle. The door opened with a peculiar flourish, and all 3 rose to their feet. The person who entered was a very stately lady. She wore a cap with black ribbons. With the door-handle still in her hand, she made a slight obeisance, in which her whole body joined, afterwards to become more erect than before. Having introduced herself to Godmother as Mrs. Gurley, the lady superintendent of the institution, she drew up a chair, let herself down upon it, and began to converse with the air of ineffable condescension. While she talked, Laura examined her with a child's thirst for detail. Mrs. Gurley was large and generous of form, and she carried her head in such a haughty fashion that it made her look taller than she really was. She had a high colour, her black hair was touched with grey, her upper teeth were prominent. She wore gold eyeglasses, many rings, a long gold chain which hung from an immense cameo brooch at her throat, and a black apron with white flowers on it, one point of which was pinned to her ample bosom. The fact that Laura had just such an apron in her box went only a very little way towards reviving her spirits, for altogether Mrs. Gurley was the most impressive person she had ever set eyes on. Beside her, Godmother was nothing but a plump, short-sighted, fidgety lady. Particularly awe-inspiring was Mrs. Gurley when she listened to another speaking. She held her head a little to one side, her teeth met her underlip, and her big ringed hands toyed incessantly with the long gold chain, in a manner which seemed to denote that she set little value on what was being said. Awful, too, was the habit she had of suddenly lowering her head and looking at you over the tops of her glasses. When she did this, and when her teeth came down on her lip, you would have liked to shrink to the size of a mouse. Godmother, it was true, was not afraid of her, but Cousin Grace was hushed at last, and as for Laura herself, she consciously wore a fixed little simper which was meant to put it beyond doubt that butter would not melt in her mouth. Godmother now asked if she might say a few words in private, and the two ladies left the room. As the door closed behind them, Cousin Grace began to be audible again. "Oh, snakes!" she giggled, and her double chin spread itself. "There's a Tartar for you! Don't I thank my stars it's not me that's being shunted off here. She'll give you what for." "I don't think so. I think she's very nice," said Laura staunchly, out of an instinct that made her wary of showing fear, or pain, or grief. But her heart began to bound again for the moment in which she would be left alone. "You see," said Cousin Grace, "it'll be bread and water for a week if you can't do a mare first go-off, not to mention the deponents." "What's a mare?" asked Laura anxiously, and her eyes grew so big that they seemed to fill her face. But Cousin Grace only laughed till it seemed probable that she would burst her bodice, and Laura blushed, aware that she had compromised herself anew. There followed a long and nervous pause. "I bet Godmother's asking her not to wallop you too often." The tease had just begun afresh when the opening of the door forced her to swallow her sentence in the middle. Godmother would not sit down, so the dreaded moment had come. "Now, Laura, be a good girl and learn well, and be a comfort to your mother. Not that there's much need to urge her to her books," Godmother interrupted herself, turning to Mrs. Gurley. "The trouble her dear mother has always had has been to keep her from them." Laura glowed with pleasure. Now at least the awful personage would know that she was clever, and loved to learn. But Mrs. Gurley smiled the chilliest thinkable smile of acknowledgment, and did not reply a word. She escorted the other to the front door, and held it open for them to pass. Then, however, her pretence of affability faded clean away. Turning her head just so far that she could look down her nose at her own shoulder, she said, "Follow me," in a tone Mother would not have used even to Sarah. Feeling inexpressibly small, Laura was about to obey when a painful thought struck her. "Oh, please, I had a box with my clothes in it," she cried. "Oh, I hope they haven't forgotten and taken it away again." But she might as well have spoken to the hat stand. Mrs. Gurley had sailed off, and was actually approaching a turn in the hall before Laura made haste to follow her, and to keep further anxiety about her box to herself. They went past one staircase, round a bend into the shadows as black as if outside no sun were shining, and began to ascend another flight of stairs, which was the widest Laura had ever seen. The banisters were as thick as your arm, and on one side of the stair carpeting the space was broad enough for two to walk abreast. What a splendid game of trains you could have played there! On the other hand, the landing windows were so high up that only a giant could have seen out of them. These things occurred to Laura mechanically. What really occupied her, as she trudged behind, was how she could please this hard-faced woman and make her like her. For the desire to please, to be liked by all the world, was the strongest her young soul knew. And there must be a way, for Godmother had found it without difficulty. She took 2 steps at once to get nearer to the portly back in front of her. "What a very large place this is," she said in an insinuating voice. She hoped the admiration thus subtly expressed in the form of surprise would flatter Miss Gurley, as a kind of co-proprietor, but it was evident that it did nothing of the sort. The latter seemed to have gone deaf and dumb, and marched on up the stairs, her hands clasped at her waist, her eyes fixed ahead, like a walking stone statue. On the top floor she led the way to a room at the end of a long passage. There were 4 beds in this room, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a wall cupboard. But at first sight Laura had eyes only for the familiar object that stood at the foot of one of the beds. "Oh, there's my box!" she cried. "Someone must have brought it up." It was unroped. She had simply to hand over the key. Mrs. Gurley went down on her knees before it, opened the lid, and began to pass the contents to Laura, directing her where to lay and hang them. Overawed by such complaisance, Laura moved nimbly about the room, shaking and unfolding, taking care to be back at the box to the minute so as not to keep Mrs. Gurley waiting. And her promptness was rewarded. The stern face seemed to relax. At the mere hint of this, Laura grew warm through and through, and as she could neither control her feelings nor keep them to herself, she rushed to an extreme and overshot the mark. "I've got an apron like that. I think they're so pretty," she said cordially, pointing to the one Mrs. Gurley wore. The latter abruptly stopped her work, and resting her hands on the sides of the box, gave Laura one of the dreaded looks over her glasses, looked at her from top to toe, and as though she were only now beginning to see her. There was a pause, a momentary suspension of the breath, which Laura soon learned to expect before a rebuke. "Little gells," said Mrs. Gurley, and even in the midst of her confusion Laura could not but be struck by the pronunciation of this word. "Little gells are required to wear white aprons when they come here." A break after each word, as well as an emphatic headshake, accentuated their severity. "And I should like to know if your mother has never taught you that it is very rude to point, and also to remark on what people wear." Laura went scarlet. If there was one thing she, mother, all of them prided themselves on, it was the good manners that had been instilled into them since their infancy. The rough reproof seemed to scorch her. She went to and fro more timidly than before. Then, however, something happened which held a ray of hope. "Why, what is this?" asked Mrs. Gurley freezingly, and held up to view, with the tips of her fingers, Laura thought, a small black prayer book. "Pray, are you not a dissenter?" For the college was nonconformist. "Well, no, I'm not," said Laura, in a tone of intense apology. Here, at last, was her chance. "But it really doesn't matter a bit. I can go to another church quite well. I even think I'd rather, for a change. And the service isn't so long, at least so I've heard, except the sermon," she added truthfully. Had she denied religion altogether, the look Mrs. Gurley bent on her could not have been more annihilating. "There is, unfortunately, no occasion for you to do anything of the kind," she retorted. "I myself am an Episcopalian, and I expect those gals who belong to the Church of England to attend it with me." The unpacking at an end, Mrs. Gurley rose, smoothed down her apron, and was just on the point of turning away, when on the bed opposite Laura's she espied an undergarment, lying wantonly across the counterpane. At this blot on the orderliness of the room she seemed to swell like a turkey-cock, seemed literally to grow before Laura's eyes, as, striding to the door, she commanded an invisible someone to send Lilith Gordon to her directly. There was an awful pause. Laura did not dare to raise her head. She even said a little prayer. Mrs. Gurley stood working at her chain and tapping her foot, like a beast waiting for its prey, thought the child. And at last a hurried step was heard in the corridor. The door opened and a girl came in, high-coloured and scant of breath. Laura darted one glance at Mrs. Gurley's face, then looked away and studied the pattern of a quilt, trying not to hear what was said. Her throat swelled, grew hard and dry with pity for the culprit. But Lilith Gordon, a girl with sandy eyebrows, a turned-up nose, and a thick plait of red gold hair, and a figure so fully developed that Laura mentally dubbed it a lady's figure, and put its owner down for years older than herself, Lilith Gordon neither fell on her knees nor sank through the floor. Her lashes were lowered in a kind of dog-like submission, and her face had gone very red when Laura ventured to look at her again. But that was all. And Mrs. Gurley having swept Jove-like from the room, this bold girl actually set her finger to her nose and muttered, "Old brimstone beast!" As she passed Laura too, she put out her tongue and said, "Now then, goggle-eyes, what have you got to stare at?" Laura was deeply hurt. She had gazed at Lilith out of the purest sympathy, and now, as she stood waiting for Mrs. Gurley, who seemed to have forgotten her, the strangeness of things and the general unfriendliness of the people struck home with full force. The late afternoon sun was shining in an unfamiliar way. Outside were strange streets, strange noises, a strange white dust, the expanse of a big, strange city. She felt unspeakably far away now from the small, snug domain of home. Here nobody wanted her. She was alone among strangers, who did not even like her. She had already, without meaning it, offended 2 of them. Another second, and the shameful tears might have found their way out. But at this moment there was a kind of preparatory boom in the distance, and the next a great bell clanged through the house, pealing on, long after one's ears were rasped by the din. It was followed by an exodus from the rooms round about. There was a sound of voices and of feet. Mrs. Gurley ceased to give orders in the passage, and returning bade Laura put on a pinafore and follow her. They descended the broad staircase. At a door just at the foot Mrs. Gurley paused and smoothed her already faultless bands of hair, then turned the handle and opened the door with a majestic swing Laura had that day once before observed. End of chapter 4.
This reading by Kara Schallenberg. Chapter 5. 55 heads turned as if by clockwork, and 55 pairs of eyes were levelled at the small girl in the white apron, who meekly followed Mrs. Gurley down the length of the dining-room. Laura crimsoned under the unexpected ordeal, and tried to fix her attention on the flouncing of Mrs. Gurley's dress. The room seemed hundreds of feet long, and not a single person at the tea-tables but took stock of her. The girls made no scruple of leaning backwards and forwards, behind and before their neighbours, in order to see her better, and even the governesses were not above having a look. All were standing. On Mrs. Gurley assigning Laura a place at her own right hand, Laura covered herself with confusion by taking her seat at once, before grace had been said, and before the 55 had drawn in their chairs with the noise of a cavalry brigade on charge. She stood up again immediately, but it was too late. An audible titter whizzed round the table. The new girl had sat down. For minutes after, Laura was lost in the pattern on her plate, and not till tongues were loosened and dishes being passed did she venture to steal a glance round. There were 4 tables, with a governess at the head and foot of each to pour out tea. It was more of a hall than a room, and had high church-like windows down one side. At both ends were scores of pigeonholes. There was a piano in it, and a fireplace. It had pale blue walls, and only strips of carpet on the floor. At present it was darkish, for the windows did not catch the sun. Laura was roused by a voice at her side. Turning, she found her neighbour offering her a plate of bread. "No, thank you," she said impulsively, for the bread was cut in chunks, and did not look inviting. But the girl nudged her on the sly. "You'd better take some," she whispered. Laura then saw that there was nothing else, but she saw too the smiles and signs that again flew round. The new girl had said no. Humbly she accepted the butter and the cup of tea which were passed to her in turn, and as humbly ate the piece of rather stale bread. She felt forlornly miserable under the fire of all these unkind eyes, which took a delight in marking her slips. At the smallest further mischance, she might disgrace herself by bursting out crying. Just at this moment, however, something impelled her to look up. Her vis-à-vis, whom she had as yet scarcely noticed, was staring hard. And now, to her great surprise, this girl winked at her, winked slowly and deliberately with the right eye. Laura was so discomposed that she looked away again at once, and some seconds elapsed before she was brave enough to take another peep. The wink was repeated. It was a black-haired girl this time, a girl with small blue eyes, a pale freckled skin, and large white teeth. What most impressed Laura, though, was her extraordinary gravity. She chewed away with a face as solemn as a parson's, and then just when you were least expecting it, came the wink. Laura was fascinated. She lay in wait for it beforehand, and was doubtful whether to feel offended by it, or to laugh at it. But at least it made her forget her mishaps, and did away with the temptation to cry. When, however, Mrs. Gurley had given them the signal, and the 55 had pushed back their chairs and set them to the table again with the same racket as before, Laura's position was a painful one. Everybody pushed and talked and laughed, in a hurry to leave the hall, and no one took any notice of her except to stare. After some indecision, she followed the rest through a door. Here she found herself on a veranda facing the grounds of the school. There was a long bench, on which several people were sitting. She took a modest seat at one end. 2 of the younger governesses looked at her and laughed, and made a remark. She saw her roommate, Lilith Gordon, arm in arm with a couple of companions. The winker of the tea-table turned out to be a girl of her own age, but of a broader make. She had fat legs, which were encased in thickly ribbed black stockings. As she passed the bench, she left the friend she was with to come up to Laura and dig her in the ribs. "Didn't she like her bread and butter, poor little thing?" she said. Laura shrank from the dig, which was rough, but she could not help smiling shyly at the girl, who looked good-natured. If only she had stayed and talked to her, but she was off and away, her arm round a comrade's neck. Besides herself, there was now only an elderly governess left, who was reading. She, Laura, in her solitude, was conspicuous to every eye. But at this juncture up came two rather rollicking older girls, one of whom was fair, with a red complexion. As soon as their loud voices had driven the governess away, the smaller of the two, who had a pronounced squint, turned to Laura. "Hullo, you kid," she said. "What's your name?" Laura artlessly replied. She was dumbfounded by the storm of merriment that followed. Maria Morell, the fat girl, went purple and had to be thumped on the back by her friend. "Oh, my!" she gasped, when she had got her breath. "Oh, my! Hold me, someone, or I shall split. Oh, golly! Laura Tweedle Rambotham! Laura Tweedle Rambotham!" Her voice trailed off again. Gosh! Was there ever such a name? She laughed till she could laugh no more, rocking backwards and forwards and from side to side, while her companion proceeded to make further inquiries. "Where do you come from?" the squint demanded of Laura, in a businesslike way. Laura named the township quaveringly. "What's your father?" "He's dead," answered the child. "Well, but I suppose he was alive once, wasn't he, duffer? What was he before he was dead?" "A barrister." "What did he die of?" "Consumption." "How many servants do you keep?" "One." "How much have you got a year?" "I don't know." "How old are you?" 12 1/4. "Who made your dress?" "Mother." "Oh, I say, hang it, that's enough. Stop teasing the kid," said Maria Morell, when the laughter caused by the last admission had died away. But the squint spied a friend, ran to her, and there was a great deal of whispering and sniggering. Presently the pair came sauntering up and sat down, and after some artificial humming and hawing, the newcomer began to talk, in a loud and fussy manner, about certain acquaintances of hers called Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Both the fat girl and the squint split with laughter. Laura sat with her hands locked one inside the other. There was no escape for her, for she did not know where to go. But when the third girl put the regulation question, "What's your name and what's your father?" she turned on her with the courage of despair. "What's yours?" she retorted hotly, at the same time not at all sure how the big girl might revenge herself. To her relief, the others burst out laughing at their friend's bafflement. "That's one for you, Kate Horner," said Maria with a chuckle. "Not bad for the kid. Come on, kid, will you have a walk round the garden?" "Oh, yes, please," said Laura, reddening with pleasure, and there she was, arm in arm with her fat savior, promenading the grounds like any other of the 55. She assumed, as well as she could, an air of feeling at her ease even in the presence of the cold and curious looks that met her. The fat girl was protective, and Laura felt too grateful to her to take it amiss that every now and then she threw back her head and laughed anew at the remembrance of Laura's patronymics, or that she still exchanged jokes about them with the other couple when they met. But by this time half an hour had slipped away, and the girls were fast disappearing. Maria Morell loitered till the last minute, then said she too must be off to stew. Everyone was hastening across the veranda laden with books, and disappearing down a corridor. Left alone, Laura made her way back to the dining hall. Here some of the very young boarders were preparing their lessons, watched over by a junior governess. Laura lingered for a little, to see if no order were forthcoming, then diffidently approached the table and asked the governess if she would please tell her what to do. "I'm sure I don't know," answered that lady, disinclined for responsibility. "You'd better ask Miss Chapman. Here, Maggie, show her where the study is." Laura followed the little girl over the veranda and down the corridor. At the end, the child pointed to a door, and on opening this Laura found herself in a very large, brightly lighted room, where the boarders sat at two long tables with their books before them. Every head was raised at her entrance. In great embarrassment she threaded her way to the more authoritative-looking of the governesses in charge, and proffered her request. It was not understood, and she had to repeat it. "I'm sure I don't know," said Miss Day in her turn. She had stiff black wavy hair, a vivid color, and a big thick nose which made her profile resemble that of a horse. "Can't you twiddle your thumbs for a bit? Oh, well, if you're so desperately anxious for an occupation, you'd better ask Miss Chapman." The girls in the immediate neighborhood laughed noiselessly, in a bounden-duty kind of way, at their superior's pleasantry, and Laura, feeling as though she had been hit, crossed to the other table. Miss Chapman, the head governess, was neither so hard-looking nor so brilliant as Miss Day. She even eyed Laura somewhat uneasily, meanwhile toying with a long gold chain, after the manner of the lady superintendent. "Didn't Mrs. Gurley tell you what to do?" she queried. "I should think it likely she would. Oh, well, if she didn't, I suppose you'd better bring your things downstairs. Yes, and ask Miss Zielinski to give you a shelf." Miss Zielinski, she was the governess in the dining-hall, said, "Oh, very well," in the rather whiny voice that seemed natural to her, and went on reading. "Please, I don't think I know my way," ventured Laura. "Follow your nose and you'll find it," said Miss Zielinski, without looking up, and was forthwith wrapped in her novel again. Once more Laura climbed the wide staircase. It was but dimly lighted, and the passages were in darkness. After a few false moves, she found her room, saw that her box had been taken away, her books left lying on a chair. But instead of picking them up, she threw herself on the bed and buried her face in the pillow. She did not dare to cry, for fear of making her eyes red, but she hugged the cool linen to her cheeks. "I hate them all," she said passionately, speaking aloud to herself. "Oh, how I hate them!" And wild schemes of vengeance flashed through her young mind. She did not even halt at poison or the knife. A big cake sent by Mother, of which she invited all alike to partake, and into which she inserted a fatal poison, so that the whole school died like rabbits, or a nightly stabbing, a creeping from bed to bed in the dark, her penknife open in her hand. But she had not lain thus for more than a very few minutes when steps came along the passage, and she had only just time to spring to her feet before one of the little girls appeared at the door. "You're to come down at once." "Don't you know you're not allowed to stay upstairs?" asked Miss Zielinski crossly. "What were you doing?" And as Laura did not reply, "What was she doing, Jessie?" "I don't know," said the child. "She was just standing there." And all the little girls laughed, after the manner of their elders. Before Laura had finished arranging her belongings on the shelves that were assigned to her, some of the older girls began to drop in from the study. One unceremoniously turned over her books, which were lying on the table. "Let's see what the kid's got." Now Laura was proud of her collection. It really made a great show, for a daughter of godmother's had once attended the college, and her equipment had been handed down to Laura. "Why, you don't mean to say a kid like you's in the second Principia already?" said a big girl, and held up, incredulously, Smith's black and red boards. "Wherever did you learn Latin?" In the reediest of voices Laura was forced to confess that she had never learnt Latin at all. The girl eyed her in dubious amaze, then burst out laughing. "Oh, I say," she called to a friend, "here's a rum go. Here's this kid brings the second Principia with her and doesn't know the first." Several others crowded round, and all found this divergence from the norm, from the traditional method of purchasing each book new and as it was needed, highly ridiculous. Laura, on her knees before her shelf, pretended to be busy, but she could not see what she was doing, for the mist that gathered in her eyes. Just at this moment, however, in marched Maria Morell. "Here, I say, stop that!" she cried. "You're teasing that kid again. I won't have it. Here, come on, kid. Laura Tweedledum, come and sit by me for supper." For the second time Laura was thankful to the fat girl. But as ill luck would have it, Miss Chapman chanced to let her eyes stray in their direction, and having fingered her chain indecisively for a little, said, "It seems a pity, doesn't it, Miss Day, that that nice little girl should get in with that vulgar set?" Miss Chapman liked to have her opinions confirmed, but this was a weakness Miss Day did not pamper. Herself strong-minded, she could afford to disregard Miss Chapman's foibles. So she went on with her book and ignored the question. But Miss Zielinski, who lost no opportunity of making herself agreeable to those over her, said with foreign emphasis, "Yes, indeed it does." So Laura was summoned and made to sit down at the end of the room, close to the governesses, and beside the very big girls, girls of 18 and 19, who seemed older still to her, with their figures and waists and skirts that touched the ground. Instinctively she felt that they resented her proximity. The biggest of all, a pleasant-faced girl with a kind smile, said, on seeing her downcast air, "Poor little thing, never mind." But when they talked among themselves, they lowered their voices and cast stealthy glances at her, to see if she were listening. Supper over, 3 chairs were set out in an exposed position. The big bell in the passage was lightly touched. Everyone fetched a hymn book, one with music in it being handed to Miss Chapman at the piano. The door opened to admit first Mrs. Gurley, then the principal and his wife, a tall, fair gentleman in a long coat, and a sweet-faced lady who wore a rose in her velvet dress. "Let us sing in the 157th hymn," said the gentleman, who had a Grecian profile and a drooping sandy mustache. And when Miss Chapman had played through the tune, the 55, the governesses, the lady and gentleman rose to their feet and sang, with halting emphasis, of the Redeemer and his mercy, to Miss Chapman's accompaniment, which was as indecisive as her manner, the left hand dragging lamely along after the right. "Let us read in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd epistle of Paul to the Thessalonians." Everyone laid her hymn book on the table and sat down to listen to Paul's words, which the sandy gentleman read to a continual nervous movement of the left leg. "Let us pray." Obeying the word, the 55 rose, faced about, and knelt to their chairs. It was an extempore prayer, and a long one, and Laura did not hear much of it, for the 2 big girls on her right kept up throughout a running conversation. Also, when it was about half over, she was startled to hear Miss Zielinski say, in a shrill whisper, "Heavens, there's that mouse again!" and audibly draw her skirts round her. Even Miss Chapman, praying to her piano chair some distance off, had heard, and turned her head to frown rebuke. The prayer at an end, Mr. and Mrs. Strachey bowed vaguely in several directions, shook hands with the governesses, and left the room. This was the signal for 2 of the teachers to advance with open Bibles. "Here, little one, have you learned your verse?" whispered Laura's pleasant neighbor. Laura knew nothing of it, but the big girl lent her a Bible, and, since it was not a hard verse, and every girl repeated it, it was quickly learned. "I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and find out knowledge of witty inventions." Told off in batches, they filed up the stairs. On the first landing stood Miss Day, watching with lynx eyes to see that no books or eatables were smuggled to the bedrooms. In a strident voice she exhorted the noisy to silence, and the loiterers to haste. Laura sped to her room. She was fortunate enough to find it still empty. Tossing off her clothes, she gabbled ardently through her own prayers, drew the blankets up over her head, and pretended to be asleep. Soon the lights were out, and all was quiet. Then, with her face burrowed deep, so that not a sound could escape, she gave free play to her tears. End of Chapter 5. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on September 24th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Recording by Kristen Luoma, greenkri.com. The Getting of Wisdom, Chapter 6. My dear mother, I sent you a postcard. Did you get it? I told you I got here all right and liked it very much. I could not write a long letter before I had no time, and we are only allowed to write letters 2 evenings a week, Tuesday and Friday. When we have done our lessons for next day, we say, "Please may I write now?" and Miss Chapman says, "Have you done everything?" And if we say we have, she says yes. And if you sit at Miss Day's table, Miss Day says it. And sometimes we haven't, but we say so. I sit up by Miss Chapman, and she can see everything I do, and at tea and dinner and breakfast, I sit beside Mrs. Gurley. Another girl in my class sits opposite, and one sits beside me, and we would rather sit somewhere else. I don't care for Mrs. Gurley much. She is very fat, and never smiles, and never listens to what you say unless she scolds you. And I think Miss Chapman is afraid of her too. Miss Day is not afraid of anybody. I am in the first class. I am in the college, and under that is the school. Only very little girls are in the school. They go to bed at 8:30 and do their lessons in the dining hall. I do mine in the study and go to bed with the big girls. They wear dresses down to the ground. Lilith Gordon is a girl in my class. She is in my room, too. She is only as old as me, and she wears stays and has a beautiful figure. All the girls wear stays. Please send me some. I have no waist. A governess sleeps in our room, and she has no teeth. She takes them out every night and puts them in water when the light is out. Lilith Gordon and the other girls say good night to her after she has taken them off, and then she can't talk properly, and we want to hear her. I think she knows, for she is very cross. I don't learn Latin yet till I go to the second class. My sums are very hard. For supper there is only bread and butter and water if we don't have cake and jam of our own. Please send me some strawberry jam and another cake. Tell Sarah there are 3 servants to wait at dinner. They have white aprons and a cap on their heads. They say, "Will you take beef, miss?" I remain, your loving daughter, Laura. Dear Pin, I am very busy. I will write you a letter. You would not like being here. I think you should always stop at home. You will never get as far as long division. Mrs. Gurley is an awful old beast. All the girls call her that. You would be frightened of her. In the afternoon, after school, we walk 2 and 2, and you ask a girl to walk with you, and if you don't, you have to walk with Miss Chapman. Miss Chapman and Miss Day walks behind, and they watch to see you don't laugh at boys. Some girls write letters to them and say they will meet them up behind a tree in the corner of the garden. A paling is loose and the boys put letters in. I think boys are silly, but Maria Morrill says they are tip-top. That means awfully jolly. She writes a letter to boys every week. She takes it to church and drops it, coming out, and he picks it up and puts an answer through the fence. We put our letters on the mantelpiece in the dining hall, and Mrs. Gurley or Miss Chapman reads the address to see we don't write to boys. They are shut up. She can't read the inside. I hope you don't cry so much at school. No one cries. Now Miss Chapman says it's time to stop. I remain, your affectionate sister, Laura. P.S. I took the red lining out of my hat. Warrenega, Sunday. My dear Laura, we were very glad to get your letters which came this morning. Your postcard, written the day after you arrived at the college, told us little or nothing. However, Godmother was good enough to write us an account of your arrival, so that we were not quite without news of you. I hope you remembered to thank her for driving in all that way to meet you and take you to school, which was very good of her. I am glad to hear you are settling down and feeling happy, and I hope you will work hard and distinguish yourself so that I may be proud of you. But there are several things in your letters I do not like. Did you really think I shouldn't read what you wrote to Pin? You are a very foolish girl if you did. Pin, the silly child, tried to hide it away because she knew it would make me cross, but I insisted on her showing it to me, and I am ashamed of you for writing such nonsense to her. Maria Morel must be a very vulgar-minded girl to use the expression she does. I hope my little girl will try to only associate with nice-minded girls. I didn't send you to school to get nasty ideas put into your head, but to learn your lessons well and get on. If you write such vulgar, silly things again, I shall complain to Mrs. Gurley or Mr. Strachey about the tone of the college, and what goes on behind their backs. I think it is very rude of you to call Mrs. Gurley names. Also, about the poor governess who has to wear false teeth. Wait till all your own teeth are gone, and then see how you will like it. I do want you to have nice feelings and not grow rough and rude. There is evidently a very bad tone among some of the girls, and you must be careful in choosing your friends. I am sorry to hear you are only in the lowest class. It would have pleased me better if you had got into the second, but I always told you you were lazy about your sums. You can do them well enough if you like. You don't need stays. I have never won them myself, and I don't intend you to either. Your own muscles are quite strong enough to bear the weight of your back. Bread and water is not much of a supper for you to go to bed on. I will send you another cake soon, and some jam, and I hope you will share it with the other girls. Now, try and be sensible and industrious, and make nice friends, and then I shan't have to scold you. Your loving mother, J.T.R. P.S. Another thing in your letter I don't like. You say you tell your governess you have finished your lessons when you have not done so. That is telling an untruth, and I hope you are not going to be led away by the examples of bad girls. I have always brought you children up to be straightforward, and I am astonished at you beginning fibbing as soon as you get away from home. Fibbing soon leads to something worse. P.P.S. You must have written your letter in a great hurry, for your spelling is anything but perfect. You are a very naughty girl to meddle with your hat. Pin has written a letter, which I enclose, though her spelling is worse than ever. Dear Laura, Mother says you are a very silly girl to write silly letters. I think you are silly too. I should be frightened of Miss Gurley. I don't want to go to school. I would rather stop with Mother and be a comfort to her. I think it is naughty to drop letters in church, and very silly to write to boys. Boys are so silly. Sarah sends her love. She says she would not wear a cap on her head, not for anything. She says she would just as soon wear a ring through her nose. I remain, your loving sister, Pin. Dear Mother, please, please don't write to Mrs. Gurley about the tone in the college, or not to Mr. Strachey either. I will never be so silly again. I am sorry my letters were so silly. I won't do it again. Please don't write to them about it. I don't go much with Maria Morel. Now I think she is vulgar too. I know 2 nice girls now in my own class. Their names are Inez and Bertha. They are very nice and not at all vulgar. Maria Morel is fat and has a red face. She is much older than me, and I don't care for her now. Please don't write to Mrs. Gurley. I will never call her names again. I had to write my letter quickly, because when I have done my lessons, it is nearly time for supper. I am sorry my spelling was wrong. I will take more pains next time. I will learn hard and get on, and soon I will be in the 2nd class. I did not mean I said I had done my lessons when I had not done them. The other girls say it, and I think it is very wrong of them. Please don't write to Mrs. Gurley. I will try and be good and sensible, and not do it again if you only won't write. I remain, your affectionate daughter, Laura. P.S. I can do my sums better now. Warrenega. My dear Laura, my letter evidently gave you a good fright, and I am not sorry to hear it, for I think you deserved it for being such a foolish girl. I hope you will keep your promise and not do it again. Of course, I don't mean that you are not to tell me everything that happens at school, but I want you to only have nice thoughts and feelings and grow into a wise and sensible girl. I am not going to write a long letter today. This is only a line to comfort you and let you know that I shall not write to Mrs. Gurley or Mr. Strachey as long as I see that you are being a good girl and getting on well with your lessons. I do want you to remember that you are a lady, though you are poor, and must behave in a ladylike way. You don't tell me what the food at the college is like, and whether you have blankets enough on your bed at night. Do try and remember to answer the questions I ask you. Sarah is busy washing today, and the children are helping her by sitting with their arms in the tubs. I am to tell you from Pin that Maggie is molting badly and has not eaten much since you left, which is just 3 weeks today. Your loving mother. Friday. My dear Mother, I was so glad to get your letter. I am so glad you will not write to Mrs. Gurley this time, and I will promise to be very good and try to remember everything you tell me. I am sorry I forgot to answer the questions. I have 2 blankets on my bed, and it is enough. The food is very nice for dinner. For tea we have to eat a lot of bread and butter. I don't care for bread much. Sometimes we have jam, but we are not allowed to eat butter and jam together. A lot of girls get up at 6 and go down to practice. They don't dress and have their bath. They just put on their dressing gowns on top of their nightgowns. I don't go down now till 7. I make my own bed. We have prayers in the morning and the evening, and prayers again when the day scholars came. I do my sums better now, I think. I shall soon be in the 2nd class. Pin's spelling was dreadful, and she is nearly 9 now, and is such a baby. The girls would laugh at her. I remain, your affectionate daughter, Laura. P.S. I parsed a long sentence without any mistakes. End of chapter 6.
Recorded by Alice Atwater. Chapter 7. The mornings were beginning to grow dark and chilly. Fires were laid overnight in the outer classrooms, and the junior governess, who was on early duty, having pealed the 6 o'clock bell, flitted like a gray wraith from room to room, and from one gas jet to another, among stretched, sleeping forms. And the first few minutes' grace at an end, it was a cold, unwilling pack that threw off coverlets and jumped out of bed, to tie on petticoats and snuggle into dressing gowns and shawls, for the first approach of cooler weather was keenly felt after the summer heat. The governess blew on speedily chilblained fingers, in making her rounds of the verandas to see that each of the 20 pianos was rightly occupied, and as winter crept on, its chief outward sign an occasional thin white spread of frost, which vanished before the mighty sun of 10 o'clock, she sometimes took the occupancy for granted, and skipped an exposed room. At 8, the boarders assembled in the dining hall for prayers and breakfast. After this meal, it was Mrs. Gurley's custom to drink a glass of hot water. While she sipped, she gave audience, meting out rebukes and crushing complaints, were any bold enough to offer them, standing erect behind her chair at the head of the table, supported by one or more of the staff. To suit the season, she was draped in a shawl of crimson wool, which reached to the flounce of her skirt, and was borne by her portly shoulders with the grace of a past day. Beneath the shawl, her dresses were built, year in, year out, on the same plan. Cut in one piece, buttoning right down the front, they fitted her like an eel-skin, rigidly outlining her majestic proportions, and always short enough to show a pair of surprisingly small, well-shod feet. Thus she stood, sipping her water, and boring with her hard, unflagging eye every girl that presented herself to it. Most shrank noiselessly away as soon as breakfast was over, for unless one was very firm indeed in the conviction of one's own innocence, to be beneath this eye was apt to induce a disagreeable sense of guilt. In the case of Mrs. Gurley, familiarity had never been known to breed contempt. She was possessed of what was little short of genius for ruling through fear, and no more fitting overseer could have been set at the head of these 100 girls of all ages and degrees, gentle and common, ruly and unruly, children hardly out of the nursery and girls well over the brink of womanhood, whose ripe, bursting forms told their own tale. the daughters of poor ministers at reduced fees, and the spoilt heiresses of wealthy wool-brokers and squatters, whose dowries would mount to many thousands of pounds. Mrs. Gurley was equal to them all. In a very short time there was no more persistent shrinker from the ice of this gaze than little Laura. In the presence of Mrs. Gurley the child had a difficulty in getting her breath. Her first week of school life had been one unbroken succession of snubs and reprimands. For this, the undue familiarity of her manner was to blame. She was all too slow to grasp, being of an impulsive disposition and not naturally shy, that it was indecorous to accost Mrs. Gurley off-hand, to treat her, indeed, in any way as if she were an ordinary mortal. The climax had come one morning. It still made Laura's cheeks burn to remember it. She had not been able to master her French lesson for that day, and seeing Mrs. Gurley chatting to a governess, had gone thoughtlessly up to her and tapped her on the arm. "Mrs. Gurley, please, do you think it would matter very much if I only took half this verb today? It's coudre, and means to sew, you know, and it's so hard. I don't seem to be able to get it into my head." Before the words were out of her mouth, she saw that she had made a terrible mistake. Mrs. Gurley's face, which had been smiling, froze to stone. She looked at her arm as though the hand had bitten her, and Laura's sudden shrinking did not move her, to whom seldom any one addressed a word unbidden. "How dare you interrupt me when I am speaking?" she hissed, punctuating her words with the ominous headshakes and pauses. "The first thing, miss, for you to do will be to take a course of lessons in manners. Your present ones may have done well enough in the outhouse to which you have evidently belonged. They will not do here in the company of your betters." Above the child's head the two ladies smiled significantly at each other, assured that, after this, there would be no further want of respect. But Laura did not see them. The iron of the thrust went deep down into her soul. No one had ever yet cast a slur upon her home. Retreating to a lavatory, she cried herself nearly sick, making her eyes so red that she was late for prayers and trying to wash them white. Since that day she had never of her own free will approached Mrs. Gurley again, and even avoided those places where she was likely to be found. This was why one morning, some 3 weeks later, on discovering that she had forgotten one of her lesson books, she hesitated long before re-entering the dining-room. The governesses still clustered round their chief, and the pupils were not expected to return. But it was past 9 o'clock. In a minute the public prayer bell would ring, which united boarders, several hundred day scholars, resident and visiting teachers, in the largest classroom. And Laura did not know her English lesson. So she stole in, cautiously dodging behind the group, in a twitter lest the dreaded eyes should turn her way. It was Miss Day who spied her and demanded an explanation. "Such carelessness! You girls would forget your heads if they weren't screwed on," retorted the governess, in the dry, violent manner that made her universally disliked. Thankful to escape with this, Laura picked out her book and hurried from the room. But the thoughts of the group had been drawn to her. "The greatest little oddity we've had here for some time," pronounced Miss Day, pouting her full bust in decisive fashion. "She is, indeed," agreed Miss Zielinski. "I don't know what sort of place she comes from, I'm sure," continued the former, "but it must be the end of creation. She's utterly no idea of what's what, and as for her clothes, they're fit for a Punch and Judy show." "She's had no training either. Stupid, I call her," chimed in one of the younger governesses, whose name was Miss Snodgrass. "She doesn't know the simplest things, and her spelling is awful. And yet, do you know, at history the other day, she wanted to hold forth about how London looked at Elizabeth's reign, when she didn't know a single one of the dates." "She can say some poetry," said Miss Zielinski, "and she's read Scott." One and all shook their heads at this, and Mrs. Gurley went on shaking hers, and smiling grimly. "Ah, the way gels are brought up nowadays," she said. "There was no such thing in my time. We were made to learn what would be of some use, and to help us afterwards." Elderly Mrs. Chapman twiddled her chain. "I hope I did right, Mrs. Gurley. She had 1 week's early practice, but she looked so white all day after it that I haven't put her down for it again. I hope I did right?" "Oh, well, we don't want them ill, you know," replied Mrs. Gurley, in the rather irresponsive tone she adopted towards Miss Chapman. "As long as it isn't mere laziness." "I don't think she's lazy," said Miss Chapman. "At least, she takes great pains with her lessons at night." This was true. Laura tried her utmost with an industry born of despair. For the comforting assurance of speedy promotion, which she had given Mother, had no root in fact. These early weeks only served to reduce, bit by bit, her belief in her own knowledge. How slender this was, and of how little use to her in her new state, she did not dare to confess, even to herself. Her disillusionment had begun the day after her arrival, when Dr. Bugson, the headmaster, to whom she had gone to be examined in arithmetic, flung up hands of comical dismay at her befogged attempts to solve the mysteries of long division. An upper class was taking a lesson in Euclid, and in the intervals between her mazy reckonings she had stolen glances at the master. A tiny little nose was as if squashed flat on his face, above a grotesquely expressive mouth, which displayed every one of a splendid set of teeth. He had small, short-sighted, red-rimmed eyes, and curly hair which did not stop growing at his ears, but went on curling, closely cropped, down the sides of his face. He taught at the top of his voice, thumped the blackboard with a pointer, was biting at the expense of a pupil who confused the angle BFC with the angle BFG, a moment later to volley forth a broad Irish joke which convulsed the class. He bewitched Laura. She forgot her sums in the delight of watching him, and this made her learning seem a little scantier than it actually was, for she had to wind up in a great hurry. He pounced down upon her. The class laughed anew at his playful horror, and yet again at the remark that it was evident she had never had many pennies to spend, or she would know better what to do with the figures that represented them. In these words Laura scented a reference to Mother's small income, and grew as red as fire. In the lowest class in the college she sat bottom, for a week or more. What she did know, she knew in such an awkward form that she might as well have known nothing. And after a few efforts to better her condition, she grew cautious, and hesitated discreetly before returning one of these ingenuous answers which, in the beginning, had made her the Merry Andrew of the class. She could, for instance, read a French story-book without skipping very many words. But she had never heard a syllable of the language spoken, and her first attempts at pronunciation caused even Miss Zielinski to sit back in her chair and laugh till the tears ran down her face. History Laura knew in a vague, pictorial way. She and Pin had enacted many a striking scene in the garden, such as "Not angles, but angels," or "Did the pump drain overflow, Canute and his silly courtiers." And she had also had out-of-the-way scraps of information about the characters of some of the monarchs, or, as the governess had complained, about the state of London at a certain period. But she had never troubled her head with dates. Now they rose before her, a hard, dry, black line, from 1066 on, accompanied, not only by the kings who were the cause of them, but by dull laws and their duller repeals. Her lessons in English alone gave her a mild pleasure. She enjoyed taking a sentence to pieces to see how it was made. She was fond of words, too, for their own sake, and once, when Miss Snodgrass had occasion to use the term elomiocenary, Laura was so enchanted by it that she sought to share her enthusiasm with her neighbor. This girl, a fat little Jewess, went crimson from trying to stifle her laughter. "What is the matter with you girls down there?" cried Miss Snodgrass. "Carrie Isaacs, what are you laughing like that for?" "It's Laura Rambotham, Miss Snodgrass. She's so funny," spluttered the girl. "What are you doing, Laura?" Laura did not answer. The girl spoke for her. She said it was blue." "Blue? What's blue?" snapped Miss Snodgrass. "That word. She said it was so beautiful, and that it was blue." "I didn't," Gray blue, I said," murmured Laura, her cheeks aflame. The class rocked. Even Miss Snodgrass herself had to join in the laugh while she hushed and reproved. And sometimes after this, when a particularly long or odd word occurred in the lesson, she would turn to Laura and say jocosely, "Now, Laura, come on, tell us what color that is. Red and yellow, don't you think?" But these were Tom Fool's colors, and Laura kept a wise silence. One day at geography, the pupils were required to copy the outline of the map of England. Laura, about to begin, found to her dismay that she had lost her pencil. To confess the loss meant one of the hard, public rebukes from which she shrank, and so, while the others drew, heads and backs bent low over their desks, she fidgeted and sought, on her lap, the bench, the floor. "What on earth's the matter?" asked her neighbor crossly. It was the black-haired boarder who had winked at Laura the first evening at tea. Her name was Bertha Ramsay. "I can't draw a stroke if you shake like that." "I've lost my pencil." The girl considered Laura for a moment, then pushed the lid from a box of long, beautifully sharpened drawing pencils. "Here, you can have one of these." Laura eyed the well-filled box admiringly, and modestly selected the shortest pencil. Bertha Ramsay, having finished her map, leaned back in her seat. "And next time you feel inclined to boo-hoo at the tea-table, hold on to your eyebrows and sing Rule Britannia. Did it want its money, poor ickle sing?" Here Bertha's chum, a girl called Inez, chimed in from the other side. "It's all well for you," she said to Bertha, in a deep, slow voice. "You're a weekly boarder." Laura had the wish to be very pleasant in return for the pencil, so she drew a sigh, and said with overemphasis, "How nice for your mother to have you home every week." Bertha only laughed at this, in a teasing way. "Yes, isn't it?" But Inez leaned across behind her and gave Laura a poke. "Shut up," she telegraphed. "Who's talking down there?" came the governess's cry. "Here, you, the new girl. Laura, what's your name? Come up to the map." A huge map of England had been slung over an easel. Laura was required to take the pointer and show where Stafford lay. With the long stick in her hand, she stood stupid and confused. In this exigency, it did not help her that she knew, from hearsay, just how England looked. That she could see, in fancy, its evergreen grass, thick hedges, and spreading trees, its never-dry rivers, its hoary old cathedrals, its fogs and sea-mists, and overpopulous cities. She stood face to face with the most puzzling map in the world, a map seared and scored with boundary lines, black and bristling with names. She could not have laid her finger on London at this moment, and as for Stafford, it might as well have been in the moon. While the class straggled along the veranda at the end of the hour, Inez came up to Laura's side. "I say, you shouldn't have said that about her mother." She nodded mysteriously. "Why not?" asked Laura, and colored at the thought that she had again, without knowing it, been guilty of a faux pas. Inez looked round to see that Bertha was not within hearing, then put her lips to Laura's ear. "She drinks." Laura gaped incredulous at the girl, her young eyes full of horror. From actual experience, she hardly knew what drunkenness meant. She had hitherto associated it only with the lowest class of Irish agricultural laborer, or with those dreadful white women who lived, by choice, in Chinese camps. That there could exist a mother who drank was unthinkable, outside the bounds of nature. "Oh, how awful!" she gasped, and turned pale with excitement. Inez could not help giggling at the effect produced by her words. The new girl was a rum stick, and no mistake. But as Laura's consternation persisted, she veered about. "Oh, well, I don't know for certain if that's it, but there's something awfully queer about her." "Oh, how do you know?" asked her breathless listener, mastered by a morbid curiosity. "I've been there, at Vaucluse, from a Sunday till Monday. She came in to lunch, and she only talked to herself, not to us. She tried to eat mustard with her pudding, too, and her meat was cut up in little pieces for her. I guess if she'd had a knife she'd have cut our throats." "Oh!" was all Laura could get out. "I was so frightened my mother said I shouldn't go again." "Oh, I hope she doesn't ask me. What shall I do if she does?" "Look out, here she comes. Don't say a word. Bertha's awfully ashamed of it," said Inez, and Laura had just time to give a hasty promise. "Hullo, you two! What are you gassing about?" cried Bertha, and dealt out a couple of her rough and friendly punches. "I say, who's on for a race up the garden?" They raced, all three, with flying plaits and curls, much kicking up of long black legs, and a frank display of frills and tuckers. Laura won, for Inez's wind gave out halfway, and Bertha was heavy of foot. Leaning against the palings, Laura watched the latter come puffing up to join her. Bertha with the shameful secret in the background of a mother who was not like other mothers. End of chapter 7.
This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Chapter 8. Laura had been, for some 6 weeks or more, a listless and unsuccessful pupil, when one morning she received an invitation from Godmother to spend the coming monthly holiday from Saturday till Monday at Prahran. The month before, she had been one of the few girls who had nowhere to go. She had been forced to pretend that she liked staying in, did it in fact by preference. Now her spirits rose. Marina, Godmother's younger daughter, from whom Laura inherited her schoolbooks, was to call for her, by a little after 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. Laura had finished her weekly mending, tidied her bedroom, and was ready dressed even to her gloves. It was a cool, crisp day, and her heart beat high with expectation. From the dining hall it was not possible to hear the ringing of the front door bell, but each time either of the maids entered with a summons, Laura half rose from her chair, sure that her turn had come at last. But it was 9:30, then 10, then past. It struck 11. The best of the day was passing, and still Marina did not come. Only 2 girls besides herself remained. Then respectively an aunt and a mother were announced, and these 2 departed. Laura alone was left. She had to bear the disgrace of Miss Day observing, "Well, it looks as if your friends had forgotten all about you, Laura." Humiliated beyond measure, Laura had thoughts of tearing off her hat and jacket and declaring that she felt too ill to go out. But at last, when she was almost sick with suspense, Mary put her tidy head in once more. "Miss Rambotham has been called for." Laura was on her feet before the words were spoken. She sped to the reception room. Marina, a short, sleek-haired, soberly dressed girl of about 20, had Godmother's brisk, matter-of-fact manner. She offered Laura her cheek to kiss. "Well, I suppose you're ready now?" Laura forgave her the past 2 hours. "Yes, quite, thank you," she answered. They went down the asphalted path and through the garden gate, and turned to walk townwards. For the first time since her arrival, Laura was free again, a prisoner at large. Round them stretched the broad white streets of East Melbourne. At their side was the thick exotic greenery of the Fitzroy Gardens. On the brow of the hill rose the massive proportions of the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Laura could have danced as she walked at Marina's side. After a few queries, however, as to how she liked school and how she was getting on with her lessons, Marina fell to contemplating a strip of paper that she held in her hand. Laura gathered that her companion had combined the task of calling for her with a morning's shopping, and that she had only worked half through her list of commissions before arriving at the college. At the next corner they got on to the outside car of a cable tramway, and were carried into town. Here Marina entered a cooperative grocery store, where she was going to give an order for a quarter's supplies. She was her mother's housekeeper, and had an incredible knowledge of groceries, as well as a severely practical mind. She stuck her fingernail into butter, tasted cheeses off the blade of a knife, ran her hands through currants, nibbled biscuits, discussed brands of burgundy and desiccated suits, Laura meanwhile looking on, from a high, uncomfortable chair, with a somewhat hungry envy. When everything, down to pepper and salt, had been remembered, Marina filled in a cheque, and was just about to turn away, when she recollected an affair of some empty cases, which she wished to send back. Another 10 minutes' parley ensued. She had to see the manager, and was closeted with him in his office, so that by the time they emerged into the street again a full hour had gone by. "Getting hungry?" she inquired of Laura. "A little, but I can wait," answered Laura politely. "That's right," said Marina, off whose appetite the edge had no doubt been taken by her various nibblings. "Now there's only the chemist." They rode to another street, entered a druggist's, and the same thing on a smaller scale was repeated, except that here Marina did no tasting, but for a stray gelatine or jujube. By the time the shop door closed behind them, Laura could almost have eaten licorice powder. It was 2 o'clock, and she was faint with hunger. "We'll be home in plenty of time," said Marina, consulting a neat watch. "Dinner's not till 3 today, because of father." Again a tramway jerked them forward. Some half-mile from their destination Marina rose. "We'll get out here. I have to call at the butcher's." At 2:45 it was a very white-faced, exhausted little girl that followed her companion into the house. "Well, I guess you'll have a fine healthy appetite for dinner," said Marina, as she showed her where to hang up her hat and wash her hands. Godmother was equally optimistic. From the sofa of the morning room, where she sat knitting, she said, "Well, you've had a fine morning's gadding about, I must say. How are you? And how's your dear mother?" "Quite well, thank you." Godmother scratched her head with a spare needle, and the attention she had had for Laura evaporated. "I hope, Marina, you told Graves about those empty jam jars he didn't take back last time?" Marina, without lifting her eyes from a letter she was reading, returned, "Indeed, I didn't. He made such a rumpus about the sugar boxes that I thought I'd try to sell them to Peterson instead." Godmother grunted, but did not question Marina's decision. "And what news have you from your dear mother?" she asked again, without looking at Laura, just as she never looked at the stocking she held, but always over the top of it. Here, however, the dining bell rang, and Laura, spared the task of giving more superfluous information, followed the two ladies to the dining room. The other members of the family were waiting at the table. Godmother's husband, he was a lawyer, was a morose, black-bearded man who, for the most part, kept his eyes fixed on his plate. Laura had heard it said that he and Godmother did not get on well together. She supposed this meant that they did not care to talk to each other, for they never exchanged a direct word. If they had to communicate, it was done by means of a third person. There was the elder daughter, Georgina, dumpier and still brusquer than Marina; the eldest son, a bank clerk, who was something of a dandy and did not waste civility on little girls; and lastly there were two boys, slightly younger than Laura, black-haired, pug-nosed, pugnacious little creatures, who stood in awe of their father, and were all the wilder when not under his eye. Godmother mumbled a blessing, and the soup was eaten in silence. During the meat course, the bank clerk complained in extreme displeasure of the way the laundress had of late dressed his collars. These were so high that, as Laura was not slow to notice, he had to look straight down the two sides of his nose to see his plate, and announce that he would not be home for tea, as he had an appointment to meet some chappies at 5, and in the evening was going to take a lady friend to Brock's fireworks. These particulars were received without comment, as the family plied its pudding spoons. Georgina in her turn made a statement. "Joey's coming to take me driving at 4." It looked as if this remark, too, would founder on the general indifference. Then Marina said warningly, as if recalling her parents' thoughts, "Mother!" Awakened, Godmother jerked out, "Indeed, and I hope if you go you'll take the boys with you." "Indeed, and I don't see why we should." "Very well, then, you'll stop at home, if Joey doesn't choose to come to the Point. Now hold your tongue, Mother. I'll do nothing of the sort." "Crikey!" said the younger boy, Irwin, in a low voice. "Joey's got to take us riding." "If you and Joey can't get yourselves properly engaged," snapped Godmother, "then you shan't go driving without the boys, and that's the end of it." Like dogs barking at one another, thought Laura, listening to the loveless bandying of words. She was unused to the snappishness of the Irish manner, which sounds so much worse than it is meant to be, and she was chilled anew by it when, over the telephone, she heard Georgie holding a heated conversation with Joey. He was a fat young man, with hanging cheeks, small eyes, and a lazy, lopsided walk. "Hello, here's a little girl. What's her name? Say, this Kitty can come along too." As it had leaked out that Marina's afternoon would be spent between the shelves of her storeroom, preparing for the incoming goods, Laura gratefully accepted the offer. They drove to Marlborough Tower. With their backs to the horse sat the two boys, mercilessly alert for any display of fondness on the part of the lovers. Sat Laura, with her straight, inquisitive black eyes. Hence Joey and Georgie were silent, since, except to declare their feelings, they had nothing to say to each other. The tower reached, the mare was hitched up, and the ascent of the light wooden erection begun. It was a blowy day. "Boys first," commanded Joey, "'cause of the petticoats." His speech was as lazy as his walk. He himself led the way, followed by Irwin and Marmaduke, and Laura, at Georgie's bidding, went next. She clasped her bits of skirts anxiously to her knees, for she was just as averse to the frills and flounces that lay beneath being seen by Georgie as by any of the male members of the party. Georgie came last, and, though no one was below her, so tightly wound about was she that she could hardly advance her legs from one step to another. Joey looked approval, but the boys sniggered, and kept it up till Georgie, having gained the platform, threatened them with a clout on the head. On the return journey a dispute arose between the lovers. It related to the shortest road home, waxed hot, and was rapidly taking on the dimensions of a quarrel, when the piebald mare shied at a traction engine and tried to bolt. Joey gripped the reins and passed his free arm round Georgie's waist. "Don't be frightened, darling." Though the low chaise rocked from side to side, and there seemed a likelihood of its capsizing, the two boys squirmed with laughter, and dealt out sundry nudges, kicks and pokes, all of which were received by Laura, sitting between them. She herself turned red with embarrassment. At the same time she wondered why Joey should believe George was afraid. There was no sign of it in Georgie's manner. She sat stolid and unmoved. Besides, she, Laura, was only a little girl, and felt no fear. She also asked herself why Joey should suddenly grow concerned about Georgie. when, a moment before, they had been so rude to each other. These were interesting speculations, and the chase having ceased to sway, Laura grew meditative. In the evening Godmother had a visitor, and Laura sat in a low chair, listening to the ladies talk. It was dull work, for, much as she liked to consider herself almost grown up, she yet detested the conversation of real grown-ups with a child's heartiness. She was glad when 9 o'clock struck and Marina, lighting a candle, told her to go to bed. The next day was Sunday. Between breakfast and church time yawned 2 long hours. Georgie went to a Bible class. Marina was busy with orders for the dinner. It was a bookless house, like most Australian houses of its kind. In Marina's bedroom alone stood a small bookcase containing school and Sunday school prizes. Laura was very fond of reading, and as she dressed that morning had cast longing looks at these volumes, had evenly shyly fingered the glass doors. But they were locked. Breakfast over, she approached Marina on the subject. The latter produced the key, but only after some haggling, for her idea of books was to keep the gilt on their covers untarnished. "Well, at any rate, it must be a Sunday book," she said ungraciously. She drew out the giant cities of Bashan and Syria's holy places, and with this Laura retired to the drawing-room, where Godmother was already settled for the day, with a suitable magazine. When the bells began to clang, the young people, primly hatted, their prayer books in their hands, walked to the neighbouring church. There Laura sat once more between the boys, Marina and Georgie stationed like sentinels at the ends of the pew, ready to pounce down on their brothers if necessary, to confiscate animals and eatables, or to rap impish knuckles with a Bible. It was a spacious church. The pew was in a side aisle. One could see neither reading desk nor pulpit, and the words of the sermon seemed to come from a great way off. After dinner, Laura and the boys were dispatched to the garden, to stroll about in Sunday fashion. Here, no elder person being present, the natural feelings of the trio came out. The distaste of a quiet little girl for rough boys and their pranks, the resentful indignation of the boys at having their steps dogged by a sneak and a telltale. As soon as they had rounded the tennis court and were out of sight of the house, Erwin and Marmaduke clambered over the palings and dropped into the street, vowing a mysterious vengeance on Laura if she went indoors without them. The child sat down on the edge of the lawn under a mulberry tree and propped her chin on her hands. She was too timid to return to the house and brave things out. She was also afraid of someone coming into the garden and finding her alone, and of her then being forced to tell. For most of all she feared the boys, and their vague, rude threats. So she sat and waited, and waited. The shadows on the grass changed their shapes before her eyes. Distant chapel bells tinkled their quarter of an hour, and were still again. The blighting torpor of a Sunday afternoon lay over the world. Would tomorrow ever come? She counted on her fingers the hours that had still to crawl by before she could get back to school, counted twice over to be sure of them, and all but yawned her head off with ennui. But time passed, and nothing happened. She was on the verge of tears when two black heads bobbed up above the fence. The boys scrambled over, red and breathless, and hurried her into tea. She wakened next morning at daybreak, so eager was she to set out, but Marina had 101 odd jobs to do before she was ready to start, and it struck 9:30 as the two of them neared the college. Childlike, Laura felt no special gratitude for the heavy pot of mulberry jam Marina bore on her arm, but at sight of the stern, grey stone building she could have danced with joy, and on the front door swinging to behind her, she drew a deep sigh of relief. End of chapter 8. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Chapter 9. From this moment on, the moment when Mary, the maid's pleasant smile, saluted her, Laura's opinion of life at school suffered a change. She was glad to be back. That was the first point. Just as an adventurous sheep is glad to regain the cover of the flock. Learning might be hard, the governesses mercilessly secure in their own wisdom, but here she was at least a person of some consequence, instead of as at godmother's a more negligible null. Of her unlucky essay at holiday making she wrote home guardedly. The most telltale sentence in her letter was that in which she said she would rather not go to godmother's again in the meantime. But there was such a lack of warmth in her account of the visit that mother made this, together with the above remark, the text for a scolding. "You're a very ungrateful girl," she wrote, "to forget all godmother has done for you. If it hadn't been for her supplying you with books and things I couldn't have sent you to school at all. And I hope when you grow up you'll be as much of a help to me as Marina is to her mother. I'd much rather have you good and useful than clever, and I think for a child of your age you see things with very sharp, unkind eyes. Try and only think nice things about people and not be always spying out their faults. Then you'll have plenty of friends and be liked wherever you go." Laura took the statement about the goodness and cleverness with a grain of salt. She knew better. Mother thought it the proper thing to say, and she would certainly have preferred the two qualities combined, but, had she been forced to choose between them, there was small doubt how her choice would have fallen out. And if, for instance, Laura confessed that her teachers did not regard her as even passable intelligent, there would be a nice to-do. Mother's ambitions knew no bounds, and, wounded in these, she was quite capable of writing post-haste to Mrs. Gurley or Mr. Strachey, complaining of their want of insight, and bringing forward a string of embarrassing proofs. So, leaving mother to her pleasing illusions, Laura settled down again to her role of dunce, now, though, with more equanimity than before. School was really not a bad place after all. This had for some time been her growing conviction, and the visit to godmother seemed to bring it to a head. About this time, too, a couple of pieces of good fortune came her way. The first, she was privileged to be third in the friendship between Inez and Bertha, a favour of which she availed herself eagerly, though the three were as different from one another as three little girls could be. Bertha was a good-natured romp, hard-fisted, thick of leg, and of a plodding but ineffectual industry. Inez, on the other hand, was so pretty that Laura never tired of looking at her. She had a pale skin, hazel eyes, brown hair with a yellow light in it, and a Greek nose. Her mouth was very small, her nostrils were mere tiny slits, and so lazy was she that she seldom more than half opened her eyes. Both girls were well over 14, and very fully developed. Compared with them, Laura was like nothing so much as a skinny young colt. She was so grateful to them for tolerating her that she never took up a stand of real equality with them, proud and sensitive. She was always ready to draw back and admit their prior rights to each other. Hence, the friendship did not advance to intimacy. But such as it was very comforting. She no longer needed to sit alone in recess. she could link arms and walk the garden with complacency, and many were the supercilious glances she now threw at Maria Morell and that clique, for her new friends belonged socially to the best set in the school. In another way, too, their company made things easier for her. Neither of them aimed high, and both were well content with the lowly places they occupied in the class. And so Laura, who was still in her young confusion, unequal to discovering what was wanted of her, grew comforted by the presence and support of her friends, and unmindful of higher opinion, and Miss Chapman, in supervising evening lessons, remarked with genuine regret that little Laura was growing perky and lazy. Her second piece of good luck was of quite a different nature. Miss Hicks, the visiting governess for geography, had a gift for saying biting things that really bit. She bore Inez a peculiar grudge, for she believed that certain faculties slumbered behind the Grecian profile, and that only the girl's ingrained sloth prevented them. One day she lost patience with this sluggish pupil. "I'll tell you what it is, Inez," she said. "You're blessed with a real woman's brain, vague, slippery, inexact, interested only in the personal aspect of a thing. You can't concentrate your thoughts, and worst of all, you've no curiosity about anything that really matters. You take all the great facts of existence on trust, just as a hen does, and I've no doubt you'll go on contentedly till the end of your days, without ever knowing why the ocean has tides, and what causes the seasons. It makes me ashamed to belong to the same sex." Inez's classmates tittered furiously, let the sarcasm glide over them, unhit by its truth. Inez herself, indeed, was inclined to consider the governess's taunt a compliment, as proving that she was incapable of a vulgar inquisitiveness. But Laura, though she laughed docilely with the rest, could not forget the incident. Words in any case had a way of sticking to her memory, and what Miss Hicks had said often came back to her in the days that followed. And then, all of a sudden, just as if an invisible hand had opened the door to an inner chamber, a light broke on her. Vague, slippery, inexact, interested only in the personal, every word struck home. Had Miss Hicks set out to describe her, in particular, she could not have done it more accurately. It was but too true. Until now, she, Laura, had been satisfied to know things in a slip-slop, razzle-dazzle way, to know them anyhow, as it best suited herself. She had never set to work to master a subject, to make it her own in every detail. Bits of it, picturesque scraps, striking features, what Miss Hicks no doubt meant by the personal, were all that had attracted her. Oh, and she, too, had no intelligent curiosity. She could not say that she had ever teased her brains with wondering why the earth went round the sun, and not the sun round the earth. Honestly speaking, it made no difference to her that the globe was indented like an orange, and not the perfect round you began by believing it to be. But if this were so, if she were forced to make these galling admissions, then it was clear that her vaunted cleverness had never existed, except in mother's imagination. Or, at any rate, it had crumbled to pieces like a lump of earth, under the hard, heavy hand of Miss Hicks. Laura felt humiliated, and could not understand her companions treating the matter so airily. She did not want to have a woman's brain, thank you, not one of that sort, and she smarted for the whole class. Straightway she set to work to sharpen her wits, to follow the straight road, at first with some stumbling, of course, and frequent backslidings. Intellectual curiosity could not, she discovered, be awakened to order, and she often caught herself napping. Thus, though, she speedily became one of the most troublesome askers why. Her desire for information was apt to exhaust itself in putting the question, and she would forget to listen to the answer. Besides, for the life of her, she could not drum up more interest in, say, the course of the Gulf Stream, or the formation of a plateau, than in the fact that, when Nellie Bristow spoke, little bubbles came out of her mouth, and that she needed to swallow twice as often as other people, or that when Miss Hicks grew angry her voice had a way of failing, at the crucial moment, and flattening out to nothing, just as if one struck tin after brass. No, it was indeed difficult for Laura to invert the value of these things. In another direction she did better, by dint of close attention, of pondering both the questions asked by Miss Hicks and the replies made by the cleverest pupils. She began to see more clearly where true knowledge lay. It was facts that were wanted of her, facts that were the real test of learning, facts she was expected to know. Stories, pictures of things, would not help her an inch along the road. Thus it was not the least use in the world to her to have seen the snowy top of Mount Kosciuszko stand out against a dark blue evening sky, and to know its shape to a tittle-pin. On the other hand, it mattered tremendously that this mountain was 7,308 and not 7,309 feet high. That piece of information was valuable, was of genuine use to you, for it was worth your place in the class. Thus did Laura apply herself to reach the school ideal, thus force herself to drive hard nails of fact into her vagrant thoughts, and with success, for she had, it turned out, a retentive memory, and to her joy learning by heart came easy to her, as easy as to the most brilliant scholars in the form. From now on she gave this talent full play, memorizing even pages of the history book in her zeal, and before many weeks had passed, in all lessons except those in arithmetic, you could not, alas, get sums by rote. She was separated from Inez and Bertha by the width of the class. But neither her taste of friendship and its comforts, nor the abrupt change for the better in her class fortunes, could counterbalance Laura's luckless knack of putting her foot in it. This she continued to do, in season and out of season, and not with the authorities alone. There was, for instance, that unfortunate evening when she was one of the batch of girls invited to Mrs. Strachey's drawing room. Laura, ignorant of what it meant to be blasée, had received her note of invitation with a thrill, and even enjoyed writing, in her best hand, the prescribed formula of acceptance. But she was alone in this. By the majority of her companions these weekly parties were frankly hated, the chief reason being that every guest was expected to take a piece of music with her. Even the totally unfit had to show what they could do, and the fact that cream tarts were served for supper was not held to square accounts. "It's all very well for you," grumbled Laura's roommate, Lilith Gordon, as she lathered her thick white arms and neck before dressing. "You're a new girl. You probably won't be asked." Laura did not give the matter a second thought. Hastily selecting a volume of music, she followed the rest of the white dresses into the passage. The senior girl tapped at the drawing room door. It was opened by no other than the principal himself. In the girl's eyes, Mr. Strachey stood over 6 feet in his stocking soles. He had also a most arrogant way of looking down his nose, and of tugging intolerantly at his long, drooping moustache. There was little need for him to assume the frigid contemptuousness of Mrs. Gurley's manner. His mere presence, the very unseeingness of his gaze, inspired awe. Tales ran of his wrath, where it roused, but few had experienced it. He quelled the high spirits of these young colonials by his dignified air of detachment. Now, however, he stood there affable and smiling, endeavouring to put a handful of awkward girls at their ease. But neither his nor Mrs. Strachey's efforts availed. It was impossible for the pupils to throw off, at will, the crippling fear that governed their relations with the principal. To them, his amiability resembled the antics of an uncertain-tempered elephant, with which you could never feel safe. Besides, on this occasion it was a young batch, and of particularly mixed stations. And so a dozen girls, from 12 to 15 years old, sat on the extreme edges of their chairs, and replied to what was said to them, with dry throats. Though the youngest of the party, Laura was the least embarrassed. She had never known a nursery, but had mixed with her elders since her babyhood, and she was not of a shy disposition. Indeed, she still had to be reminded daily that shyness was expected of her. So she sat and looked about her. It was an interesting room in which she found herself. Low bookshelves, 3 shelves high, ran round the walls, and on the top shelf were many outlandish objects. What an evening it would have been had Mr. Strachey invited them to examine these ornaments, or to handle the books, instead of having to pick up a little here and there by chance. From the shelves, her eye strayed to the pictures on the walls. One in particular struck her fancy. It hung over the mantelpiece, and was a man's head seen in profile, with a long hooked nose, and wearing a kind of peaked cap. But that was not all. Behind this head were other profiles of the same face, and seeming to come out of clouds. Laura stared hard, but could make nothing of it, and meanwhile her companions were rising with sickly smiles, to seat themselves, red as turkey cocks' combs, on the piano stool, where, with cold, stiff fingers, they stumbled through the movement of a sonata or sonatina. It was Lilith Gordon who broke the chain by offering to sing. The diversion was welcomed by Mrs. Strachey, and Lilith went to the piano. But her nervousness was such that she broke down halfway in the little prelude to the ballad. Mrs. Strachey came to the rescue. "It's so difficult, is it not, to accompany oneself?" she said kindly. "Perhaps one of the others would play for you?" No one moved. "Do any of you know the song?" 2 or 3 ungraciously admitted the knowledge, but none volunteered. It was here Laura chimed in. "I could play it," she said, and coloured at the sound of her own voice. Mrs. Strachey looked doubtfully at the thin little girl. "Do you know it, dear? You're too young for singing, I think." "No, I don't know it, but I could play it from sight. It's quite easy." Everyone looked disbelieving, especially the unhappy singer. "I've played much harder things than that," continued Laura. "Well, perhaps you might try," said Mrs. Strachey, with the ingrained distrust of the unmusical. Laura rose and went to the piano, where she conducted the song to a successful ending. Mrs. Strachey looked relieved. "Very nice indeed." And to Laura, Did you say you didn't know it, dear?" "No, I never saw it before." Again the lady looked doubtful. "Well, perhaps you would play us something yourself now." Laura had no objection. She had played to people before her fingers were long enough to cover the octave. She took the volume of Thalberg she had brought with her, selected "Home, Sweet Home", and pranced in. Her audience kept utter silence, but, had she been a little sharper, she would have grasped that it was the silence of amazement. After the prim sonatinas that had gone before, Thalberg's florid ornaments had a shameless sound. Her performance, moreover, was a startling one. The forte pedal was held down throughout. The big chords were crashed and banged with all the strength a pair of 12-year-old arms could put into them, and wrong notes were freely scattered. Still, rhythm and melody were well marked, and there was no mistaking the agility of the small fingers. Dead silence, too, greeted the conclusion of the piece. Several girls were very red, from trying not to laugh. The principal tugged at his moustache in abstracted fashion. Laura had reached her seat again before Mrs. Strachey said undecidedly, "Thank you, dear. Did you learn that piece here?" Laura saw nothing wrong. "Oh, no, at home," she answered. "I wouldn't care to play the things I learn here to people. They're so dull." A girl emitted a faint squeak, but a half turn of Mrs. Strachey's head subdued her. "Oh, I hope you will soon get to like classical music also," said the lady gravely, and in all good faith. "We prefer it, you know, to any other." "Do you mean things like the air in G with variations?" "I'm afraid I never shall. There's no tune in them." Music was as fatal to Laura's equilibrium as wine would have been. Finding herself next Mr. Strachey, she now turned to him and said, with what she believed to be ease of manner, "Mr. Strachey, will you please tell me what that picture is hanging over the mantelpiece? I've been looking at it ever since I came in, but I can't make it out. Are those ghosts, those things behind the man, or what?" It took Mr. Strachey a minute to recover from his astonishment. He stroked hard, and the look he bent on Laura was not encouraging. "It seems to be all the same face," continued the child, her eyes on the picture. "That," said Mr. Strachey, with extreme deliberation, "that is the portrait, by a great painter, of a great poet, Dante Alighieri." "Oh, Dante, is it?" said Laura showily. She had once heard the name. "Oh, yes, of course. I know now. He wrote a book, didn't he, called Faust? I saw it over there by the door. What lovely books!" But here Mr. Strachey abruptly changed his seat, and Laura's thirst for information was left unquenched. The evening passed, and she was in blessed ignorance of anything being amiss, till the next morning after breakfast she was bidden to Mrs. Gurley. A quarter of an hour later, on her emerging from the ladies' private sitting room, her eyes were mere swollen slits in her face. Instead, however, of sponging them in cold water and bravely joining her friends, Laura was still foolish enough to hide and have her cry out, so that when the bell rang, she was obliged to go into public prayers looking a prodigious fright, and thereby advertising to the curious what had taken place. Mrs. Gurley had crushed and humiliated her. Laura learnt that she had been guilty of a gross impertinence, in profaning the ears of the principal and Mrs. Strachey with Thalberg's music, and that all the pieces she had brought with her from home would now be taken from her. Secondly, Mr. Strachey had been so unpleasantly impressed by the boldness of her behaviour that she would not be invited to the drawing-room again for some time to come. The matter of the music touched Laura little. If they preferred their dull old exercises to what she had offered them, so much the worse for them. But the reproach cast on her manners stung her even more deeply than it had done when she was still the raw little newcomer, for she had been pluming herself of late that she was now quite the thing. And yet, painful as was this fresh overthrow of her pride, it was neither the worst nor the most lasting result of the incident that concerned her schoolfellows. By the following morning the tale of her doings was known to everyone. It was circulated in the first place, no doubt, by Lilith Gordon, who bore her a grudge for her offer to accompany the song. Had Laura not put herself forward in this objectionable way, Lilith might have escaped singing altogether. Lilith also resented her having shown that she could do it, and this feeling was generally shared. It evidenced a want of good fellowship, and made you very glad the little prig had afterwards come to grief. If you had abilities that others had not, you concealed them, instead of parading them under people's noses. In short, Laura had committed a twofold breach of school etiquette. No one, of course, vouchsafed to explain this to her. These things one did not put into words, things you were expected to know without telling. Hence, she never more than half understood what she had done. She only saw disapproval painted on faces that had hitherto been neutral, and from one or two quarters got what was unmistakable, the cold shoulder. Her little beginnings of popularity had somehow received a setback, and through her own foolish behaviour. End of chapter 9. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Chapter 10. The lesson went home. Laura began to model herself more and more on those around her, to grasp that the unpardonable sin is to vary from the common mould. In August, after the midwinter holidays, she was promoted to the second class. She began Latin, and as a reward was allowed by mother to wear her dresses an inch below her knees. She became a quick, adaptable pupil, with a parrot-like memory, and at the end of the school year delighted mother's heart with a couple of highly gilt volumes, of negligible contents. At home, during those first holidays, she gave her sister and brothers cold creeps down their spines, with her stories of the great doings that took place at school, and none of her classmates would have recognised in this arrant drawer of the long bow the unlucky little blunderbuss of the early days. On her return, Laura's circle of friends was enlarged. The morning after her arrival, on entering the dining hall, she found a new girl standing shy and awkward before the fireplace. This was the daughter of a millionaire squatter named McNamara, and the report of her father's wealth had preceded her. Yet here she now had to hang about, alone, unhappy, the target of all eyes. It might be supposed that Laura would feel some sympathy for her, having so recently undergone the same experience herself, but that was not her way. She rejoiced in barbarian fashion that this girl, older than she by about a year, and of a higher social standing, should have to endure a like ordeal. Staring heartlessly, she accentuated her part of old girl knowing all the ropes, and was so inclined to show off that she let herself in for a snub from Miss Snodgrass. Tilly McNamara joined Laura's class, and the two were soon good friends. Tilly was a short, plump girl with white teeth, rather boyish hands, and the blue-grey eyes predominant in Australia. She was usually dressed in silk, and she never wore an apron to protect the front of her frock. Naturally, too, she had a bottomless supply of pocket money. If a subscription were raised, she gave 10 shillings, where others gave 1, and on the Saturday holidays she flung about with half-crowns, as Laura would have been afraid to do with pennies. For the latter, with her tiny doll, which had to last so and so long, since no more was forthcoming, it was a difficult task to move gracefully among companions, none of whom knew what it meant to be really poor. Many trivial mortifications were the result, and countless small subterfuges had to be resorted to prevent it leaking out just how paltry her allowance was. But the question of money was, after all, trifling compared with the infinitely more important one of dress. With regard to dress, Laura's troubles were manifold. It was not only that here, too, by reason of Mother's straitened means, she was forced to remain an outsider, that, in itself, she would have borne lightly, for, as little girls go, she was indifferent to finery. Had she had a couple of new frocks a year, in which she could have been neat and unremarkable, she would have been more than content. But, from her babyhood on, Laura, and Pin with her, had lamented the fact that children could not go about clad in sacks, mercifully indistinguishable one from another, for they were the daughters of an imaginative mother, and balked in other outlets. This imagination had wreaked itself on their clothing. All her short life long, Laura had suffered under a home-made, picturesque style of dress, and she had resented, with a violence even Mother did not gauge, this use of her young body as a peg on which to hang fantastic garments. After her 10th birthday she was, she thanked goodness, considered too old for the quaint shapes beneath which Pin still groaned. But there remained the matter of colour for Mother to sin against, and in this she seemed to grow more intemperate year by year. Herself dressed always in the soberest browns and blacks, she liked to see her young flock gay as paradise birds, lighting up a drab world, and when Mother liked a thing, she was not given to consulting the wishes of little people. Those were awful times when she went, say, to Melbourne, and bought as a bargain a whole roll of cloth of an impossible colour, which had to be utilised to the last inch, or when she unearthed, from an old trunk, some antiquated garment to be cut up and reshaped, a Paisley shawl, a puce ball dress, even an old pair of green rep curtains. It was thus a heavy blow to Laura to find, on going home, that Mother had already bought her new spring dress. In one respect all was well. It had been made by the local dressmaker, and consequently had not the home-made cut that Laura abhorred. But the colour! Her heart fell to the pit of her stomach the moment she set eyes on it, and only with difficulty did she restrain her tears. Mother had chosen a vivid purple, of a crude, old-fashioned shade. Now, quite apart from her personal feelings, Laura had come to know very exactly, during the few months she had been at school, the views held by her companions on the subject of colour. No matter how sumptuous or how simple the material of which the dress was made, it must be dark, or of a delicate tint. Brilliancy was a sign of vulgarity, and put the wearer outside the better circles. Hence, at this critical juncture, when Laura was striving to ape her fellows in all vital matters, the unpropitious advent of the purple threatened to undo her. After her first dismayed inspection, she retreated to the bottom of the garden to give vent to her feelings. "I shall never be able to wear it," she moaned. "Oh, how could she buy such a thing? And I needed a new dress so awfully, awfully much." "It isn't really so bad, Laura," pleaded Pin. "It'll look darker, I'm sure, if you've got it on, and if you don't go out in the sun." "You haven't got to wear it. It was piggish of you, Pin, perfectly piggish. You might have watched what she was buying." "I did, Laura," asseverated Pin, on the brink of tears. "There was a nice dark brown, and I said, 'Take that. You would like it better.' And she said, 'Hold your tongue.' And did I think she was going to dress you as if you were your own grandmother?" This dress hung for weeks in the most private corner of Laura's school wardrobe. Her companions had all returned with new outfits, and on the first assemblage for church there was a great mustering of one another, both by girls and teachers. Laura was the only one to descend in the dress she had worn throughout the winter. Her heart was sore with bitterness, and when the handful of Episcopalians were marching to St. Stephen's on the hill, she strove to soothe her own wound. "I can't think why my dress hasn't come," she said gratuitously, out of this hurt, with an oblique glance to see how her partner took the remark. It was the good-natured Maria Morell, who was resplendent in velvet and feathers. "I expect that stupid dressmaker couldn't get it done in time. I've waited for it all the week." "What a sell!" said Maria, but with mediocre interest, for she had cocked her eye at a harmless-looking youth, who was doing his best not to blush on passing the line of girls. "I say, do look at that toff making eyes. Isn't he a nanny goat?" On several subsequent Sundays, Laura fingered, in an agony of indecision, the pleasing stuff of the dress, and ruefully considered its modish cut. Once, no one being present, she even took it out of the wardrobe, but the merciless spring sunshine seemed to make the purple shoot fire, to let loose a host of other colours it in as well, and with a shudder she rehung it on its peg. But the evil day came. After a holiday at Godmother's, she received a hot letter from Mother. Godmother had complained of her looking dowdy, and Mother was exceedingly cross. Laura was ordered to spend the coming Saturday as well at Prahran, and in her new dress, under penalty of a correspondence with Mrs. Gurley. There was no going against an order of this kind, and with death at her heart Laura prepared to obey. On the fatal morning she dawdled as long as possible over her mending, thus postponing dressing to go out till the others had vacated the bedroom, where, in order not to be forced to see herself, she kept her eyes half shut, and turned the looking-glass hind before. Although it was a warm day, she hung a cloak over her shoulders, but her arms peeped out of the loose sleeves, and at least a foot of skirt was visible. As she walked along the corridor and down the stairs, she seemed to smudge the place with colour, and directly she entered the dining-hall, comet-like, she drew all eyes upon her. Astonished titterings followed in her wake. Even the teachers goggled her, afterwards to put their heads together. In the reception-room Marina remarked at once, "Hello, Is this the new dress your mother wrote us about?" Outside, things were no better. The very tram conductors were fascinated by it, and every passer-by was a fresh object of dread. Laura waited, her heart a-thump, for the moment when he should raise his eyes and, with a start of attention, become aware of the screaming colour. At Godmother's all the faces disapproved. Georgina said, "What a guy!" when she thought Laura was out of earshot, but the boys stated their opinion openly as soon as they had her to themselves. "Oh, golly, like a parrot, ain't she?" "This way to the Purple Parrot, this way. Step up, ladies and gentlemen. A penny the whole show." That evening she tore the dress from her back and, hanging it up inside the cloak, vowed that, come what might, she would never put it on again. A day or two later, on unexpectedly entering her bedroom, she found Lilith Gordon and another girl at her wardrobe. They grew very red, and hurried giggling from the room, but Laura had seen what they were looking at. After this, she tied the dress up with string and brown paper and hid it in a drawer, under her nightgowns. When she went home at Christmas it went with her, still in the parcel, and then there was a stormy scene. But Laura was stubborn. Rather than wear the dress, she would not go back to college at all. Mother's heart had been softened by the prizes. Laura seized the occasion and extracted a promise that she should be allowed in future to choose her own frocks. And so the purple dress was passed on to Pin, who detested it with equal heartiness, but, living under Mother's eye, had not the spirit to fight against it. "Got anything new in the way of clothes?" asked Lilith Gordon, as she and Laura undressed for bed a night or two after their return. "Yes, one," said Laura shortly, for she thought Lilith winked at the third girl, a publican's daughter from Clunes. "Another like the last, or have you gone in for yellow ochre this time?" Laura flamed in silence. Great Scott, what a colour that was! Fit for an Easter fair. Miss Day said so. "It wasn't mine," retorted Laura passionately. It belonged to a girl I knew who died, and her mother gave it to me as a remembrance of her, but I didn't care for it." "I shouldn't think you did. But, I say, does your mother let you wear other people's clothes? What a rummy thing to do!" She went out of the room, no doubt to spread this piece of gossip further. Laura looked daggers after her. She was angry enough with Lilith for having goaded her to the lie, but much angrier with herself for its blundering ineffectualness. It was not likely she had been believed, and if she were, well, it made matters worse instead of better. People would conclude that she lived on charity. Always, when unexpectedly required to stand on the defensive, she said or did something foolish. That morning, for instance, a similar thing had happened. It had rankled all day in her mind. On looking through the washing, Miss Day had exclaimed in horror at the way in which her stockings were mended. "Whoever did it? They've been done since you left here. I would never have passed such dames." Laura crimsoned. "Oh, an old nurse we've got at home. We've had her for years and years, but her eyesight's going now." Miss Day sniffed audibly. "So I should think, to cobble like that." They were Mother's dames, hastily made, late at night, and with all Mother's genial impatience at useful sewing as opposed to beautiful. Laura's intention had been to shield Mother from criticism, as well as to spare Miss Day's feelings. But to have done it so clumsily as this, to have had to wince under Miss Day's scepticism. It was only a wonder the governess had not there and then taxed her with the fib. For who believed in old nurses nowadays? They were a stock property, borrowed on the spur of the moment from readings in the Family Herald from Tennyson's Lady Clare. Why on earth had such a far-fetched excuse leapt to her tongue? Why could she not have said Sarah, the servant, the maid of all work? Then Miss Day would have had no chance to snip, and she, Laura, could have believed herself believed, instead of having to fret over her own stupidity. But what she would like more than anything to know was why the mending of the stockings at home should not be Sarah's work. Why must it just be mother, her mother alone, who made herself so disagreeably conspicuous, and not merely by darning the stockings, but, what was a still greater grievance, by not even darning them well? End of chapter 10.
Read and recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, July 2006. Chapter 11. It was an odd thing, all the same, how easy it was to be friends with Lilith Gordon. Though she did not belong to Laura's set, though Laura did not even like her, and though she had had ample proof that Lilith was double-faced, not to be trusted. Yet, in the months that followed the affair of the purple dress, Laura grew more intense with the plump, sandy-haired girl than with either Bertha or Inez or Tilly. Or, to put it more exactly, she was continually having lapses into intimacy and repenting them when it was too late. In one way, Lilith was responsible for this. She could make herself very pleasant when she chose, seem to be your friend through thick and thin, thus luring you on to unbosom yourself. And afterwards she would go away and laugh over what you had told her with other girls. And Laura was peculiarly helpless under such circumstances. If it was done with tact, and with a certain amused warmth of manner, anyone could make a cat's paw of her. That Lilith and she undressed for bed together had also something to do with their intimacy. This half-hour when one's hair was unbound and replaited, and fat and thin arms wielded the brush, was the time of all others for confidences. The governess, who occupied the fourth bed, did not come upstairs till 10 o'clock. The publican's daughter, a lazy girl, was usually half asleep before the other two had their clothes off. It was in the course of one of these confidential chats that Laura did a very foolish thing. In a moment of weakness, she gratuitously gave away the secret that Mother supported her family by the work of her hands. The two girls were sitting on the side of Lilith's bed. Laura had a day of mishaps behind her, that partly, no doubt, accounted for her self-indulgence. But, in addition, her companion had just told her, unasked, that she thought her very pretty. It was not in Laura's nature to let this pass. She was never at ease under an obligation. She had to pay the coin back in kind. "Embroidery? What sort? However does she do it?" Lilith's interest was on tiptoe at once, a false and slimy interest, the victim afterwards told herself. "Oh, my mother's awfully clever. It's just lovely, too, what she does. All in silk, and ever so many different colors. She made a piano cover once, and got £50 for it." "How perfectly splendid!" But that was only a lucky chance, that she got that to do. She mostly does children's dresses and cloaks and things like that. "But she's not a dressmaker, is she?" "A dressmaker? I should think not, indeed. They're sent up, all ready to work, from the biggest shops in town." "I say, she must be clever." "She is. She can do anything. She makes the patterns up all out of her own head." And filled with pride in Mother's accomplishments and Lilith's appreciation of them, Laura fell asleep that night without a qualm. It was the next evening. Several of the boarders who had finished preparing their lessons were loitering in the dining hall, Laura and Lilith among them. In the group was a girl called Lucy, young but very saucy, for she lived at Toorak and came of one of the best families in Melbourne. She was not as old as Laura by 2 years, but was already feared and respected for the fine scorn of her opinions. Lilith Gordon had bragged, "My uncle's promised me a gold watch and chain when I pass matric." Lucy of Toorak laughed. Her nose came down and her mouth went up at the corners. "Do you think you ever will?" "G.O.K. and he won't tell, but I'll probably get the watch all the same." "Where does your uncle hang out?" "Brisbane." "Sure he can afford to buy it?" "Of course he can." "What is he?" Lilith was unlucky enough to hesitate ever so slightly. "Oh, he's got plenty of money," she asserted. "She doesn't like to say what he is." "I don't care whether I say it or not." "A butcher, perhaps? Or an undertaker?" "A butcher? He's got the biggest newspaper in Brisbane." "A newspaper? Great Scott! Her uncle keeps a newspaper." There was a burst of laughter from those standing round. Lilith was scarlet now. "It's nothing to be ashamed of," she said angrily. But Lucy of Toorak could not recover from her amusement. "An uncle who keeps a newspaper! A newspaper! Well, I'm glad none of my uncles are so rummy. I say, does he leave it at front doors himself in the morning?" Laura had at first looked passively on, well pleased to see another than herself the butt of young Lucy's wit. But at this stage of her existence she was too intent on currying favour to side with any but the stronger party, and so she joined in the boisterous mirth Lilith's admission and Lucy's reception of it excited, and flung her gibes with the rest. She was pulled up short by a hissing in her ear. "If you say one word more, I'll tell about the embroidery." Laura went pale with fright. She had been in good spirits that day, and had quite forgotten her silly confidence of the night before. Now the jeer that was on the tip of her tongue hung fire. She could not all at once obliterate her smile. That would have been noticeable. But it grew weaker, stiffer, and more unnatural, then gradually faded away, leaving her with a very solemn little face. From this night on, Lilith Gordon represented a powder mine, which might explode at any minute, and she herself had laid the train. From the outset, Laura had been accepted socially by even the most exclusive as one of themselves, and this in spite of her niggardly allowance, her ridiculous clothes. For the child had race in her, in a well-set head, in good hands and feet and ears. Her nose, too, had a very pronounced droop, which could stand only for blue blood or a Hebraic ancestor, and Jews were not received as boarders in the school. Now, loud as money made itself in this young community, effectual as it was in cloaking shortcomings, it did not go all the way. Inherited instincts and traditions were not so easily subdued. Just some of the wealthiest, too, were aware that their antecedents would not stand a close scrutiny, and thus a mighty respect was engendered in them for those who had nothing to fear. Moreover, directly you got away from the vastly rich, class distinctions were observed with an exactitude such as can only obtain in an exceedingly mixed society. The 3 professions alone were sacrosanct. The calling of architect, for example, or of civil engineer was, if a fortune had not been accumulated, utterly without prestige. Trade, any connection with trade, the merest bowing acquaintance with buying and selling, was a taint that nothing could remove, and those girls who were related to shopkeepers, or more awful still, to publicans, would rather have bitten their tongues off than have owned to the disgrace. Yet Laura knew very well that good birth and an aristocratic appearance would not avail her, did the damaging fact leak out that her mother worked for her living. Work in itself was bad enough. How greatly to be envied were those whose fathers did nothing more active than live on their money. But the additional circumstance of Mother being a woman made things 10 times worse. Ladies did not work. Someone always left them enough to live on, and if he didn't, well, then he, too, shamed the ignominy. So Laura went in fear and trembling lest the truth should come to light. In that case, she would be a pariah indeed. Went in hourly dread of Lilith betraying her. Nothing, however, happened, at least as far as she could discover, and she sought to propitiate Lilith in every possible way. For the time being, though, anxiety turned her into a porcupine, ready to erect her quills at a touch. She was ever on the lookout for an allusion to her mother's position, and for the slight that was bound to accompany it. Even the governesses noticed the change in her. 3 of them sat one evening round the fire in Mrs. Gurley's sitting room, with their feet on the fender. The girls had gone to bed. It was Mrs. Gurley's night off, and as Miss Day was also on leave, the 3 who were left could draw in more closely than usual. Miss Snodgrass had made the bread into toast, in spite of Miss Chapman's quakings lest Mrs. Gurley should notice the smell when she came in, and as they munched, Miss Snodgrass related how she had just confiscated a book Laura Rambotham was trying to smuggle upstairs, and how it had turned out that it belonged not to Laura herself, but to Lilith Gordon. She was like a little spitfire about it all the same. A most objectionable child, I call her. It was only yesterday I wanted to look at some embroidery on her apron, a rather pretty new stitch, and do you think she'd let me see it? She jerked it away and glared at me as if she would have liked to eat me. I could have boxed her ears. I never have any trouble with Laura. I don't think you know how to manage her, said Miss Chapman, and executed a little manoeuvre. She had poor teeth, and having awaited a moment when Miss Snodgrass's sharp eyes were elsewhere engaged, she surreptitiously dropped the crusts of the toast into her handkerchief. I'd be sorry to treat her as you do, said Miss Snodgrass, and yawned. Girls need to be made to sit up nowadays. She yawned again, and gazing round the room for fresh food for talk, caught Miss Zielinski with her eye. "Hello, Zelie. What are you deep in?" She put her arm round the other's neck, and unceremoniously laid hold of her book. "You naughty girl. You're at Ouida again. Always got your nose stuck in some trashy novel." "Do let me alone," said Miss Zielinski pettishly, holding fast to the book. But she did not raise her eyes, for they were wet. "You know you'll count the washing all wrong again tomorrow. Your head'll be so full of that stuff." "Yes, it's time to go, girls. Tomorrow's Saturday." And Miss Chapman sighed, for on a Saturday morning between 6 and 8 o'clock, 55 lots of washing had to be sorted out and arranged in piles. "Holy Moses, what a life!" ejaculated Miss Snodgrass, and yawned again, in a kind of furious desperation. "I swear I'll marry the first man that asks me, to get away from it, as long as he has money enough to keep me decently." "You would soon wish yourself back if you had no more feeling for him than that," reproved Miss Chapman. "Catch me! Not even if he had a hump, or kept a mistress, or was over 80. Oh dear, oh dear!" She stretched herself so violently that her bones cracked. To resume in a tone of ordinary conversation, "I do wish I knew whether to put a brown wing or a green one in that blessed hat of mine." Miss Chapman's face straightened out from its shocked expression. "Your hat? Why do you want to change it? It's very nice as it is." "My dear Miss Chapman, it's at least 6 months out of date. Zelie, you're crying." "I'm not," said Miss Zielinski weakly, caught in the act of blowing her nose. "How on earth can you cry over a book? As if it were true." "I thank God I haven't such a cold heart as you." "And I thank God I'm not a romantic idiot. But your name's not Thekla for nothing, I suppose." "My name's as good as yours, and I won't be looked down on because my father was once a German." "Mr. Kaiser, Do you want to buy a dog?" hummed Miss Snodgrass. "Girls, girls!" admonished Miss Chapman. "How you two do bicker! There, that's Mrs. Gurley now, and it's long past 10. At the creaking of the front door both juniors rose, gathered their belongings together, and hurried from the room. But it was a false alarm, and having picked up some crumbs and set the chairs in order, Miss Chapman resumed her seat. As she waited, she looked about her and wondered, with a sigh, whether it would ever be her good fortune to call this cheery little room her own. It was only at moments like the present that she could indulge such a dream. Did Mrs. Gurley stand before her, majestic in bonnet and mantle, as in a minute or two she would, or draped in her great shawl, thoughts of this kind sank to their proper level, and Miss Chapman knew them for what they were worth. But sitting alone by night, her chin in her hand, her eyes on the dying fire, around her the eerie stillness of the great house, her ambition did not seem wholly out of reach, and giving rein to her fancy, she could picture herself sweeping through the halls and rooms, issuing orders that it was the business of others to fulfill, could even think out a few changes that should be made, were she head of the staff. But the insertion of Mrs. Gurley's key in the lock, the sound of her foot on the oilcloth, was enough to waken a sense of guilt in Miss Chapman, and make her start to her feet, the drab, elderly, apologetic governess once more. End of chapter 11. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, July 2006. Chapter 12. Dara giert der Nachbar, da wird man Nachbar. Nietzsche. You might regulate your outward habit to the last button of what you were expected to wear. You might conceal the tiny flaws and shuffle over the big improprieties in your home life, which were likely to damage your value in the eyes of your companions. You might, in brief, march in the strictest order along the narrow road laid down for you by these young lawgivers, keeping perfect step and time with them. Yet of what use were all your pains if you could not marshal your thoughts and feelings, the very realest part of you, in rank and file as well, if these persisted in escaping control? Such was the question which, about this time, began to present itself to Laura's mind. It first took form on the day Miss Blount, the secretary, popped her head in at the door and announced, "At 3:30, Class 2 to Number 1." Class 2 was taking a lesson in elocution. That is to say, Mr. Repton, the visiting master for this branch of study, was reading aloud, in a sonorous voice, a chapter of Handy Andy. He underlined his points heavily, and his hearers, like the self-conscious, emotionally shy young colonials they were, felt half amused by, half superior to the histrionic display. They lounged in easy, ungraceful postures while he read, reclining one against another, or sprawling forward over the desks, their heads on their arms. It was the first hour after dinner, when one's thoughts were sleepy and stupid, and Mr. Repton was not a pattern disciplinarian, but the general abandonment of attitude had another ground as well. It had to do with the shape of the master's legs. These were the object of an enthusiastic admiration. They were generally admitted to be the handsomest in the school, and those girls were thought lucky who could get the best view of them beneath the desk. Moreover, the rumor ran that Mr. Repton had once been an actor. His long, curly hair no doubt lent weight to the report, and Class 2 was fond of picturing the comely limbs in the tights of a Hamlet or Othello. It also, of course, invented for him a lurid life outside the college walls, notwithstanding the fact that he and his sonsy wife sat opposite the boarders in church every Sunday morning, the embodiment of the virtuous commonplace. And whenever he looked at a pupil, every time he singled one of them out for special notice, he was believed to have an ulterior motive. His words were construed into meaning something they should not mean. so that the poor man was often genuinely puzzled by the reception of his friendly overtures. Such was Class Two's youthful contribution to the romance of school life. On this particular day, however, the sudden, short snap of the secretary's announcement that, instead of disappearing at 3:30, the entire school was to reassemble, galvanized the class. Glances of mingled apprehension and excitement flew round, eyes telegraphed vigorous messages, and there was little attention left for well-shaped members, or for the antics of Handy Andy under his mother's bed. But when the hour came and all classes were moving in the same direction, verandas and corridors one seething mass of girls, it was the excitement that prevailed, for any break was welcome in the uniformity of the days, and the nervous tension now felt was no more disagreeable, at bottom, than was the pleasant trepidation experienced of old by those who went to be present at a hanging. In the course of the past weeks a number of petty thefts had been committed. Day scholars who left small sums of money in their jacket pockets would find, on returning to the cloakrooms, that these had been pilfered. For a time the losses were borne in silence, because of the reluctance inherent in young girls to making a fuss. But when shillings began to vanish in the same fashion, and once even half a crown was missing, it was recognized that the thing must be put a stop to, and one bolder than the rest, and with a stronger sense of public morality, lodged a complaint. Investigations were made, a trap was set, and the thief discovered. The school was now assembled to see justice done. The great room was fuller even than at morning prayers, for then there was always an unpunctual minority. A crowd of girls who had not been able to find seats were massed together at the further end. As at prayers, visiting and resident teachers stood in a line, with their backs to the high windows. They were ranged in order of precedence, topped by Dr. Pugson, who stood next Mr. Strachey's desk. All alike wore blank, stern faces. In one of the rows of desks for two, blackened, ink-scored, dusty desks, with eternally dry inkwells, sat Laura and Tilly. Behind them Inez and Bertha. The cheeks of the four were flushed, but while the others only whispered and wondered, Laura was on the tiptoe of expectation. She could not get her breath properly, and her hands and feet were cold. Twisting her fingers in and out, she moistened her lips with her tongue. When, oh when, would it begin? These few foregoing minutes were the most trying of any, for when, in an ominous hush, Mr. Strachey entered and strode to his desk, Laura suddenly grew calm, and could take note of everything that passed. The principal raised his hand to enjoin a silence that was already absolute. "Will Miss Johns stand up?" At these words, spoken in a low, impressive tone, Bertha burst into tears and hid her face in her handkerchief. Hundreds of eyes sought the unhappy culprit as she rose, then to be cast down and remained glued to the floor. The girl stood, pale and silly-looking, and stared at Mr. Strachey much as a rabbit stares at the snake that is about to eat it. She was a very ugly girl of 14, with a pasty face, and lank hair that dangled to her shoulders. Her mouth had fallen half open through fear, and she did not shut it all the time she was on view. Laura could not take her eyes off the scene. They travelled, burning with curiosity, from Annie Johns to Mr. Strachey, and back again to the miserable thief. When, after a few introductory remarks on crime in general, the principal passed on to the present case, and described it in detail, Laura was fascinated by his oratory, and gazed full at him. He made it all live vividly before her. She hung on his lips, appreciating his points, the skilful way in which he worked up his climaxes. But then she herself knew what it was to be poor, as Annie Johns had been. She understood what it would mean to lack your tram fare on a rainy morning. According to Mr. Strachey, this was the motor impulse of the thefts, because a lolly shop had stretched out its octopus arm after you. She could imagine, too, with a shiver, how easy it would be, the loss of the first pennies having remained undiscovered, to go on to threepenny bits, and from those to sixpences, more particularly since the money had been taken, without exception, from pockets in which there was plenty. Not, Laura felt sure, in order to avoid detection, as Mr. Strachey supposed, but because to those who had so much a few odd coins could not matter. She wondered if everyone else agreed with him on this point. How did the teachers feel about it? And she ran her eyes over the row, to learn their opinions from their faces. But these were as stolid as ever. Only good old Chapman, she thought, looked a little sorry, and Miss Zielinski, yes, Miss Zielinski, was crying. This discovery thrilled Laura, just as, at the play, the fact of one spectator being moved to tears intensifies his neighbour's enjoyment. But when Mr. Strachey left the field of personal narration and went on to the moral aspects of the affair, Laura ceased to be gripped by him, and turned anew to study the pale, dogged face of the accused, though she had to crane her neck to do it. Before such a stony mask as this, she was driven to imagine what must be going on behind it, and while thus engrossed, she felt her arm angrily tweaked. It was Tilly. "You are a beast to stare like that." "I'm not staring." She turned her eyes away at once, more than half believing her own words, and then, for some seconds, she tried to do what was expected of her, to feel a decent unconcern. At her back, Bertha's purry crying went steadily on. What on earth did she cry for? She had certainly not heard a word Mr. Strachey said. Laura fidgeted in her seat, and stole a side glance at Tilly's profile. She could not, really could not miss the last scene of all, when, in masterly fashion, the principal was gathering the threads together, and so, feeling rather like Peeping Tom, she cautiously raised her eyes again, and this time managed to use them without turning her head. All other eyes were still charitably lowered. Several girls were crying now, but without a sound. And, as the last awful moments drew near, even Bertha was hushed, and of all the odd hundreds of throats, not one dared to cough. Laura's heart began to palpitate, for she felt the approach of the final climax, Mr. Strachey's periods growing ever slower and more massive. Then, after a burst of eloquence which, the child felt, would not have shamed a bishop, the principal drew himself up to his full height, and with uplifted arm thundered forth, "Herewith, Miss Annie Johns, I publicly expel you from the school. Leave it now, this moment, and never darken its doors again." When this happened, Laura was shot through by an ecstatic quiver, such as she had felt only once in her life before, and that was when a beautiful golden-haired Hamlet, who had held a Ballarat theatre entranced for a whole evening, fell dead by Laertes' sword, to the rousing plaudits of the house. Breathing unevenly, she watched, lynx-eyed, every inch of Annie Johns' progress, watched her pick up her books, edge out of her seat, and sidle through the rows of desks, watched her walk to the door with short, jerky movements, mount the 2 steps that led to it, fumble with the handle, turn it, and vanish from sight. And when it was all over, and there was nothing more to see, she fell back in her seat with an audible sigh. It was too late after this for the winding of the snaky line about the streets and parks of East Milbourne, which constituted the boarders' daily exercise. They were dispatched to stretch their legs in the garden. Here, as they walked round lawns and tennis courts, they discussed the main event of the afternoon, and were a little more vociferous than usual, in an attempt to shake off the remembrance of a very unpleasant half-hour. "I bet you Sandy rather enjoyed kicking up that shindy." "Did you see Puggy's boots again? Girls, he must take 12s. And that old blunder of a Zilphy's handkerchief. It was filthy. I told you yesterday I was sure she never washed her neck." Bertha, whose eyes had dried as rapidly as sea spray, gave Laura a dig in the ribs. "What's up with you, old Tweedledum? You're as glum as a lubra." "No, I'm not." "It's my belief that Laura was sorry for that pig," threw in Tilly. "Indeed I wasn't," said Laura indignantly. "Sorry for a thief?" "I tell you I wasn't." And this was true. Among the diverse feelings Laura had experienced that afternoon, pity had not been included. "If you want to be chums with such a mangy beast, you'd better go to school in a lock-up." "I don't know what my father'd say if he knew I'd been in the same class as a pickpocket," said the daughter of a minister from Brisbane. "I guess he wouldn't have let me stop here a week." Laura went one better. "My mother wouldn't have let me stop a day." Those standing by laughed, and a girl from the Riverina said, "Oh no, of course not," in a tone that made Laura wince and regret her readiness. Before tea she had to practice. The piano stood in an outside classroom where no one could hear whether she was diligent or idle, and she soon gave up playing and went to the window. Here, having dusted the gritty sill with her petticoat, she leaned her chin on her two palms and stared out into the sun-baked garden. It was empty now and very still. The streets that lay behind the high palings were deserted in the drowsy heat. The only sound to be heard was a gentle tinkling to vespers in the neighbouring Catholic seminary. Leaning thus on her elbows, and balancing herself first on her heels, then on her toes, Laura went on in desultory fashion with the thoughts that had been set in motion during the afternoon. She wondered where Annie Johns was now, and what she was doing, wondered how she had faced her mother, and what her father had said to her. All the rest of them had gone back at once to their everyday life. Annie Johns alone was cut adrift. What would happen to her? Would she perhaps be turned out of the house, into the streets? And Laura had a lively vision of the guilty creature in rags and tatters, slinking along walls and sleeping under bridges, eternally moved on by a ruthless London policeman, her only knowledge of extreme destitution being derived from the woeful tale of Little Joe. And to think that the beginning of it all had been the want of a trumpery tram fare. How safe the other girls were! No wonder they could allow themselves to feel shocked and outraged. None of them knew what it was not to have threepence in your pocket, while she, Laura... Yes, and it must be this same incriminating acquaintance with poverty that made her feel differently about Annie Johns and what she had done. For her feelings had been different. There was no denying that. Did she now think back over the half hour spent in number 1 and act honest Injun with herself, she had to admit that her companion's indignant and horrified aversion to the crime had not been hers, let alone their decent indifference towards the criminal. No, to be candid, she had been deeply interested in the whole affair, had even managed to extract an unseemly amount of entertainment from it. And that, of course, should not have been. It was partly Mr. Strachey's fault for making it so dramatic, but none the less she genuinely despised herself for having such a queer inside. "Pig, pig, pig," she muttered under her breath, and wrinkled her nose in a grimace. The real reason of her pleasurable absorption was, she supposed, that she had understood Annie Johns's motive better than anyone else. Well, she had had no business to understand. That was the long and the short of it. Nice-minded girls found such a thing impossible, and turned incuriously away, and her companions had been quick to recognize her difference of attitude, so they would never have dared to accuse her of sympathy with the thief, or to doubt her chorusing assertions with a sneer. For them, the gap was not very wide between understanding and doing likewise, and they were certainly right. Oh, the last wish in the world she had had was to range herself on the side of the sinner. She longed to see eye to eye with her comrades, if she had only known how to do it. For there was no saying where it might lead you. If you persisted in having odd and peculiar notions, you might even end by being wicked yourself. Let her take a lesson in time from Annie's fate. For beginning, perhaps, with ideas that were no more unlike those of her schoolfellows than were Laura's own, Annie was now a branded thief and an outcast. And the child's feelings, as she stood at the window, were not very far removed from prayer. Had they found words, they would have taken the form of an entreaty that she might be preserved from having thoughts that were different from other people's, that she might be made to feel as she ought to feel, in a proper ladylike way, and especially did she see a companion convicted of crime. Below all this, in subconscious depths, a chord of fear seemed to have been struck in her as well, the fear of stony faces, drooped lids, and stretched pointing fingers. For that night she started up with a cry, from dreaming that not Annie Johns but she was being expelled, that an army of spear-like first fingers was marching towards her, and that, try as she would, she could not get her limp heavy legs to bear her to the schoolroom door. And this dream often returned. End of chapter 12. Recorded by Betsy Bush, Marquette, Michigan, February 2007. Chapter 13. On her honorable promotion the following Christmas, she mounted 2 forms this time. Laura was a thin, middle-sized girl of 13, who still did not look her age. The curls had vanished. In their place hung a long, dark plait, which she bound by choice with a red ribbon. Tilly was the only one of her intimates who skipped a class with her. Hence, she was thrown more exclusively than before on Tilly's companionship, for it was a melancholy fact, if you were not in the same class as a girl who was your friend, your interests and hers were soon fatally sundered. On their former companions, Tilly and Laura, from their new perch, could not but look down. The two had masters now for all subjects. Euclid loomed large, Latin was no longer bounded by the first Principia, and they fussed considerably in the other's hearing over the difficulties of the little blue books that began Gallia est omnius divisa in partes tres. In the beginning they held very close together, for their new fellows were inclined to stand on their dignity with the pair of interlopers from class 2. They were all older than Tilly and Laura, and thought themselves wiser. Here were girls of 16 and 17 years of age, some of whom would progress no farther along the high road of education. As for the boarders who sat in this form, they made up a jealous little clique, and it was some time before the younger couple could discover the secret bond. Then one morning the two were sitting with a few others on the veranda bench, looking over their lessons for the day. Mrs. Gurley had snatched a moment's rest there on her way to the secretary's office, and as long as she allowed her withering eye to play upon things and people, the girls conned their pages with a great show of industry. But no sooner than she sailed away than Kate Horner leant forward and called to Maria Morell, who was at the other end of the seat. "I say, Maria, Genesis 50:32." She held an open Bible in her hand. Maria Morell frowned caution. "Dash it, Kate, mind those kids." "Oh, they won't savvy." But Laura's eyes were saucers of curiosity, for Tilly, who kept her long lashes lowered, had given her a furious nudge. With a wink and a beck to each other, the bigger girls got up and went away. "I say, what did you poke me so hard for?" inquired Laura, as she and Tilly followed in their wake at the clanging of the public prayer bell. "You soft, didn't you hear what she said?" "Of course I did," and Laura repeated the reference. "Let's look it up, then." Under cover of the prayer, Tilly sought it out, and together they bent their heads over it. On this occasion Tilly was more knowing than Laura, but on this alone, for when Laura once grasped what they were driving at, she was as nimble-witted as any. Only a day or two later it was she who, in face of Kate and Maria, invited Tilly to turn up chapter and verse. Both the elder girls burst out laughing. "My dad!" cried Kate Horner, and smacked her thigh. "This kid knows a thing or two." "You bet! I told you she wasn't born yesterday." And Maria laid her arm round Laura's shoulders. Thus was Laura encouraged, put on her mettle, and soon there was no more audacious Bible reader in the class than she. The girls were thrown thus upon the book of books, for their contraband knowledge. since it was the only frankly outspoken piece of literature allowed within the college walls. The classics studied were rigidly expurgated. The school library was kept so dull that no one over the age of 10 much cared to borrow a volume from it, and by fair means or unfair it was necessary to obtain information on matters of sex. For girls, most of whom were well across the threshold of womanhood, the subject had an invincible fascination. Such knowledge as they possessed was a strange jumble, picked up at random. In one direction they were well primed, in another supremely ignorant. Thus, though they received lectures on what was called physiology, and for these were required to commit to memory the name of every bone and artery in the body, yet all that related to a woman's special organs and chief natural function was studiously ignored. The subject being thus chastely shrouded in mystery, they were thrown back on guesswork and speculation, with the quaintest results. The fancies woven by quite big girls, for instance, round the physical feat of bearing a child into the world, would have supplied material for a volume of fairy tales. On many a summer evening at this time, in a nook of the garden, heads of all shades might have been seen pressed as close together as a cluster of settled bees, and like the humming of bees, too, were the busy whisperings and subdued buzzes of laughter that accompanied this hot discussion of the how, as a living answer to which each of them would probably some day walk the world. Innumerable theories were afloat, one more fantastic than another, and the wilder the conjecture, the greater was the respect and applause it gained. On the other hand, of less profitable information they had amassed a goodly store. Girls who came from up country could tell a lively tale of the artless habits of the blacks. Others who were at home in mining towns described the doings in Chinese camps, those unavoidable concomitants of gold-grubbing settlements. Rhymes circulated that would have staggered a back-blocker, while the governesses were, without exception, young and old, kindly and unkindly, laid under such flamboyant suspicions as the poor ladies had, for certain, never heard breathed since their own impudent school-days. This dabbling in the illicit, it had little in common with the opener grime of the ordinary schoolboy, did not even widen the outlook of these girls, for it was something to hush up and keep hidden away, to have qualms, even among themselves, about knowing, and, like all knowledge that fungus-like shrinks from the sun, it was stunted and unlovely. Their minds were warped by it, their vision was distorted. Viewed through its lens, the most natural human relations appeared unnatural. Thus, not the primmest patterns of family life could hope for mercy in their eyes. Over the family, too, man, as read by these young rigorists, was held to leave his serpent's trail of desire. For out of it all rose the vague, crude picture of woman as the prey of man. Man was animal, a composite of lust and cruelty, with no aim but that of brutality taking his pleasure. Something monstrous, yet to be adored; annihilating, yet to be sought after; something to flee, and at the same time to entice, with every art at one's disposal. As long as it was solely a question of clandestine knowledge and ingenious surmisings, Laura went merrily with the rest. Here no barrier shut her off from her companions. Always a very inquisitive little girl, she was now agog to learn new lore. Her mind, in this direction, was like a clean but highly sensitized plate, and partly because of her previous entire ignorance, partly because of her extreme receptiveness, she soon outstripped her comrades, and before long was one of the most skilful improvisers of the group, a dexterous theorist, a wicked little adept at innuendo. But that was all. A step farther, and she ran her head against a stone wall, for the invisible yeast that brought this ferment of natural curiosity to pass was the girl's intense interest in the opposite sex, a penned-up interest that clamoured for an outlet, an interest which, in the life of these prospective mothers, had already usurped the main place. Laura, on the other hand, had so far had scant experience of boys of a desirable age, nor any liking for such as she had known. Indeed, she still held to her childish opinion that they were silly, feckless creatures in spite of their greater strength and size, or downright disagreeable and antagonistic, like Godmother's Erwin and Marmaduke. No breath of their possible dangerous fascination had hitherto reached her, hence an experience that came her way at the beginning of the autumn was of the nature of an awakening. Chapter 14